Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we walk through a medieval town where the church bells never seem to stop ringing, where damp fog clings to crooked wooden houses, and where the smell of wet earth hangs permanently in the cold night air. Somewhere ahead of you, beyond the narrow lane and flickering lantern light, men are digging graves by hand while priests whisper prayers into sleeves soaked with rain. It is the sort of job nobody grows up dreaming about. In fact, you probably will not survive this. Very few people around you do. Still, somebody has to carry the lantern. Somebody has to lift the shovel. And tonight, unfortunately for your future back health, that somebody is you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, let me know your location and local time down in the comments. I always like seeing where in the world people are listening from as we wander together through history's strangest corners. Now, dim the lights. The town appears slowly through the mist as you approach the gates before dawn. You hear the bells first, slow, heavy, repeating, not celebratory bells, not wedding bells. These bells sound tired. The kind of bells that know exactly how much work waits ahead. Your boots sink into wet mud as you walk uphill toward the churchyard. Rain fell most of the night, and the narrow streets smell of soaked straw, chimney smoke, and something sour lingering beneath it all. A cartwheel creaks somewhere in the dark. A dog barks once and then decides the effort is unnecessary. Nobody talks much anymore. That is one of the first things you notice after arriving here. Medieval towns are usually noisy places. Merchants shouting, blacksmiths hammering iron, children running through alleys with absolutely no understanding of personal safety. But plague changes sound itself. Doors stay shut, voices drop low, even footsteps seem cautious. A widely accepted historical fact is that during the Black Death, many towns across Europe lost between 30 and 50% of their population within only a few years. Some villages disappeared entirely. You try not to think about that too carefully while walking toward a graveyard already running out of room. The church emerges through the fog with its stone walls darkened by rain. Lanterns flicker beside the entrance. A priest stands near the gate, rubbing his hands together inside his sleeves. He looks exhausted in the specific medieval way where people appear both deeply holy and moments away from collapsing face first into soup. He nods when he sees you. You are the new digger. You nod back. No ceremony, no grand introduction, just immediate employment in history's least relaxing industry. Inside the churchyard, the ground looks churned and uneven. Fresh earth lies in long, dark strips between crooked grave markers. Some graves still sink slightly where the soil settled too quickly. Others are so recent the rainwater has not yet washed the loose dirt flat. A man hands you a shovel, not a polished ceremonial shovel. This thing looks like it personally fought in several wars and lost all of them. The wooden handle is rough against your palms. The iron blade is bent slightly at one corner. You already miss modern ergonomic equipment. Nearby, two older gravediggers work silently beneath hooded cloaks. One coughs into his sleeve. The other pauses every few minutes to stretch his back with the slow misery of a man whose spine retired years ago without informing the rest of him. You follow them toward the far side of the churchyard where a narrow trench waits half finished. The earth smells rich and cold as you dig. Wet soil clings to the shovel blade. Your shoulders ache almost immediately. Medieval labour has a remarkable way of beginning at maximum difficulty and then somehow becoming worse. Above you, dawn barely brightens the sky. The bells ring again. You learn quickly that the church keeps careful records of the dead when possible. Priests note names, families, trades, bakers, tailors, mothers, apprentices, though increasingly the lists grow incomplete. Some bodies arrive unidentified. Others are buried before proper rites can be spoken because there are simply too many. Scholars still debate whether fear of infection changed burial customs more than religious devotion preserved them. Even now, in this little churchyard, you can see the tension clearly. Some priests insist every body deserves full ceremony. Others rush prayers in nervous whispers while stepping backward the entire time. A cold wind drifts through the cemetery carrying the scent of river water and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, somebody burns herbs. People believe certain smells protect against plague. Rosemary, juniper, lavender if they can afford it. One woman passes carrying flowers pressed tightly over her mouth like a shield. To be fair, when nobody understands germs yet, pleasant smells probably feel emotionally reassuring at minimum, and honestly, medieval towns could become fairly fragrant even without apocalyptic disease. By mid-morning, the first cart arrives. The horse pulling it looks thin and tired. Its harness creaks softly as it stops near the gate. A driver climbs down slowly, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. The cart holds 3 covered shapes beneath rough linen. Nobody reacts dramatically anymore. That unsettles you most. Not screaming, not panic, just weary acceptance. One of the gravediggers wipes mud from his beard and quietly measures space with his eyes. The priest removes his hood. A woman standing across the lane begins crying silently into her apron. Though whether for one of the dead or simply for everything you cannot tell, you help carry the first body. The weight surprises you. Human beings always seem lighter in stories somehow, but real bodies are awkward, heavy at the shoulders, difficult to balance on muddy ground. Your boots slide as you cross the churchyard. Rain begins again, very light at first. Tiny droplets settling across the graves like cold dust. The priest recites Latin prayers while water drips from the edge of his hood. You recognize almost none of the words. Still, the rhythm feels steady, familiar, like people desperately trying to preserve order while the world quietly unravels around them. An unusual medieval rumour spreads through town by afternoon. One woman swears the plague began when a comet passed overhead years earlier. Another man claims strange blue flames appeared in the marsh before sickness arrived. Medieval people searched constantly for signs and explanations, because uncertainty frightens the human mind far more than almost anything else. Honestly, modern people are not much different. We just post theories online instead of shouting them beside wells. As daylight fades, you continue digging. Your hands blister beneath the rough wooden handle. Mud cakes your boots nearly to the ankle. The church bells finally stop for a little while, and the sudden silence feels stranger than the sound itself. A crow lands atop a leaning grave marker nearby. It watches you carefully. You pause for breath and look across the cemetery. Fresh mounds stretch through the fading mist. Lanterns flicker beside the church doors. The priest kneels briefly in prayer before standing again with visible effort. This will be your life now. Cold mornings, wet earth, bells before dawn, and beneath every shovel of soil lies the uncomfortable awareness that one fever, one cough, one unlucky touch could place you inside the grave instead of beside it. The wind rustles softly through the bare trees above the churchyard as darkness settles fully over the town. Tomorrow the carts will return. Morning arrives without sunlight. The clouds sit low above the town, heavy and grey, pressing the roofs and church tower beneath a damp blanket of mist. You wake stiff and cold inside a narrow shed beside the churchyard wall, wrapped in wool that smells faintly of smoke, rainwater, and the accumulated regrets of previous owners. Your back hurts immediately. This becomes your first reliable routine as gravedigger during the plague. Wake up, hurt everywhere. Continue anyway. Outside, bells ring once more across the town. Slower today, fewer pauses between them. You pull on muddy boots still wet from yesterday and step into air sharp enough to sting your lungs. The churchyard already waits awake before dawn. Fresh carts stand near the gate. Priests move quietly through drifting fog. A pair of labourers unload rough planks beside the chapel entrance while muttering to one another in exhausted voices. The earth everywhere looks darker now, saturated by rain and constant digging. A generally accepted historical reality is that medieval churchyards often became dangerously overcrowded during plague outbreaks. Burial grounds designed for ordinary death rates suddenly faced impossible numbers. In some towns, graves were reopened early or layered closely together simply because there was nowhere else left. You understand the problem immediately. The older gravedigger named Martin leads you toward the northern edge of the cemetery carrying a lantern and a short iron rod. He walks with a limp that worsens in cold weather. Every few steps he stops to press the rod into the ground. "Too shallow," he mutters at one spot. A few feet later he shakes his head again. "Occupied already." The churchyard has become a puzzle made entirely from bodies and mud. You pass rows of tilted wooden markers. Some graves belong to merchants or respected families, marked with carved symbols and small stone borders. Others hold only rough wooden crosses already leaning sideways in wet soil. In one corner near the wall, a fresh burial collapsed slightly overnight. Rainwater pools in the depression. Martin sighs when he sees it. Nobody says the obvious thing aloud. You help repair the grave carefully with shovels and loose soil while the wind rustles bare branches overhead. Nearby, a priest recites prayers over another burial so quickly the Latin words blur together like flowing water. People still crave proper rituals even now. That surprises you. Families arrive carrying candles despite the rain. Mothers kneel in mud to whisper final blessings. Fathers remove caps with trembling hands. One old woman carefully places a tiny carved bird onto a grave mound before leaving without speaking. Human beings cling stubbornly to ceremony during disaster, maybe especially during disaster. Historians still argue whether medieval communities found genuine comfort in these rites, or whether rituals mainly provided the illusion of control against overwhelming fear. Watching mourners move through the foggy churchyard, you suspect it might be both. By midday, the cemetery feels crowded not only with the dead but with tension itself. A thin man in expensive clothing argues with one of the priests near the chapel steps. His wife died during the night, and he demands burial space beside her parents near the church wall. The priest refuses quietly but firmly. That section filled days ago. The man gestures angrily toward poorer graves near the outer edge. You notice the priest's expression harden immediately. Even plague does not erase class differences completely. Medieval society remains deeply layered. Wealthy families still expect better burial positions, because many people believe resting closer to the church offers spiritual advantage. Unfortunately, the cemetery appears unconcerned with social ambition. Rain begins falling harder, around noon. Water drips from your hood into your eyes while you dig along the eastern edge beside a stone boundary wall slick with moss. The mud grows thick enough to trap your boots. Every shovel of earth feels heavier than the last. Beside you, Martin talks quietly while working. He tells you the graveyard once seemed enormous when he first began here years earlier. Children played near the outer wall. Weddings filled the church with candles and flowers. Market stalls stood just beyond the gate selling hot pies, ribbons, and tiny religious charms. Now most stalls are empty. No ribbons, few pies, mostly silence. A strange local belief has started spreading through town that owls gathering near rooftops predict which households will lose someone next. You hear several women discussing it nervously while carrying baskets through the lane outside the cemetery wall. One claims an owl landed directly above her neighbour's chimney before 3 family members fell ill. To be fair, medieval towns had enough owls, rats, smoke, fog, bells, and unexplained deaths to keep superstition permanently employed. By afternoon, another burial cart arrives. This one carries 5 bodies. The horse pulling it snorts uneasily as wheels sink into muddy ruts near the gate. A young priest crosses himself repeatedly before helping unload the dead. His hands shake so badly he nearly drops the lantern he carries. You notice something else too. He cannot be older than 20. The older clergy are disappearing. Plague does not care about age, wisdom, or theological experience. Many priests continue visiting the sick despite enormous danger because refusing spiritual care feels unthinkable to them. In several regions during the Black Death, clergy died in staggering numbers while tending infected communities. You watch the young priest pause beside one shrouded body. Quietly, almost apologetically, he begins reciting prayers. Rain taps softly against the linen coverings. Nearby, crows gather along the cemetery wall like patient officials supervising terrible paperwork. The work continues until your arms tremble with fatigue. You stop noticing individual names after a while. That realization unsettles you deeply. At sunrise, each death feels personal. By evening, exhaustion dulls everything into movement and labor. Lift, carry, dig, cover, repeat. The human mind protects itself in strange ways. As darkness approaches, the bells finally fall silent again. Smoke drifts from scattered chimneys beyond the churchyard while cold mist curls low across the graves. Martin hands you a chunk of dark bread and a small cup of weak ale. You sit together beneath the shelter beside the tool shed, listening to distant coughing somewhere beyond the walls. The bread tastes stale. The ale tastes sour. Yet after a day digging graves in endless rain, it might as well be a feast prepared by royalty. Neither of you speaks much. Words feel expensive now. Across the cemetery, lantern light flickers around fresh graves not yet settled by rain. You notice how uneven the churchyard has become. Mounds rise everywhere like waves frozen in muddy earth. And still more space must somehow be found tomorrow. A cold breeze moves through the trees above you, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and candle wax. Somewhere deeper in town, another bell begins ringing slowly through the fog. One bell, then another. Martin closes his eyes briefly. Without saying anything, both of you stand and reach again for the shovels. The death cart announces itself long before you see it. First comes the slow grinding sound of wooden wheels pushing through wet streets. Then the horse. Then the smell. Damp straw. Mud. Smoke. Illness lingering beneath layers of rainwater and wool cloth. You stand near the church gate before sunrise, pulling your cloak tighter against the cold, while mist drifts through the lane in pale ribbons. The town still sleeps, or pretends to. Shuttered windows stare down from crooked timber houses. Water drips steadily from roof edges into puddles below. Then the cart emerges through the fog. Its lantern swings gently from the bent iron hook, throwing weak amber light across the stones. The horse moves carefully over uneven ground, ribs faintly visible beneath damp skin. Even the animal looks exhausted now. Today you ride with the driver, not because you volunteered enthusiastically for corpse transportation duty. Nobody has ever spoken that sentence in human history. But there are too many dead, too few workers, and the streets have grown increasingly dangerous for loan collectors after dark. So now you climb onto a wooden seat beside a man named Thomas, whose entire personality seems constructed from cold rain and disappointment. He nods once as you settle beside him. Neither of you wastes energy on cheerful conversation. The cart creaks forward through the narrow lane. Iron rims scrape against stone while the horse exhales pale clouds into the freezing air. Behind you, beneath rough linen coverings, several silent shapes shift slightly whenever the wheels strike deeper ruts. You try not to look backward too often. A commonly accepted historical detail is that during severe plague outbreaks, carts were frequently used to transport the dead through medieval towns, because ordinary burial practices could no longer keep pace with mortality rates. In some cities, workers moved from street to street, gathering bodies daily while bells or calls warned residents to stay clear. You understand now why people shut their windows when the cart passes. The sound alone unsettles the nerves. The streets feel narrower from up here. Houses lean overhead at strange angles. their upper floors jutting outward as though trying to overhear whispered gossip below. Rainwater and waste trickle along shallow gutters beside the road. Somewhere nearby, somebody cooks onions over a small fire. The smell mixes strangely with wet wool and smoke. Thomas finally speaks as you turn toward the market square. Used to be loud here. You glance around. The square does feel strangely empty. A few stalls remain open selling bread, candles, or watered ale, but most stand abandoned beneath soaked canvas covers. A dog sniffs beside overturned baskets near the well. Thomas points ahead with gloved fingers. Jugglers there once, musicians too. You picture it briefly. Crowds, merchants shouting, children running between carts. Then the image fades beneath the present silence. At the first house, Thomas stops the cart beside a narrow doorway marked with a small painted cross. No officials place these marks. Families do it themselves sometimes. Quiet warnings to neighbours, or prayers, or both. You climb down carrying a lantern. The door opens before you knock. Inside, the air feels warmer but heavier somehow. Candles flicker beside a bed where an old man lies wrapped in linen. Two women stand nearby with red eyes and exhausted faces. Neither speaks much while you prepare to carry the body outside. One woman presses a tiny wooden charm into the old man's folded hands before you lift him. A carved bird. You remember the woman at the graveyard yesterday leaving one atop fresh soil? Certain charms become strangely popular during plague years. Tiny saints carved from wood, wax symbols, rings believed to ward away sickness. Some people carry dried flowers or animal teeth sewn into cloth pouches. A curious fringe belief even claims emeralds can detect poisoned air by changing colour, though unfortunately gemstones remain deeply committed to not helping anyone. Historians continue debating how much medieval people truly believe these objects possessed protective power versus emotional comfort. Standing inside this candlelit room, watching grieving daughters straighten their father's burial cloth one last time. The distinction suddenly feels less important. Outside, dawn slowly lightens the sky. You place the body carefully beside the others in the cart. The horse shifts uneasily. Then onward again, street after street, door after door. Sometimes, families wait beside the road before you arrive. Sometimes, neighbours point silently toward houses already abandoned. Once, at a narrow alley near the baker's district, you find nobody alive inside at all, only silence. A pot still hanging above dead coals, rain tapping softly at the shutters. You leave quickly from that house. Even Thomas crosses himself afterward. By midday the cart grows heavier. The wheels drag deeper through mud as you pass beneath the town's central bell tower. Above, dark birds circle through pale clouds while bells ring once more across the streets. A child watches you from an upstairs window. She cannot be older than 7. Her face appears pale behind the wooden shutters. One small hand clutches the frame while the cart passes below. You wonder what she thinks when she hears the wheels, whether she counts the covered shapes, whether she knows where you're taking them. Probably yes. Children in medieval towns learn harsh truths very early. There are no carefully filtered documentaries here, no comforting educational cartoons, just life appearing directly outside your window carrying a shovel. Near the river district, a priest joins you briefly beside the cart. His boots splash through puddles while he mutters prayers beneath his breath almost continuously. Like a man terrified, silence itself might become dangerous. He tells Thomas another burial ground may soon open beyond the town walls. There is no room left, he says quietly. The words linger in cold air after he leaves. No room left. The phrase feels impossible and yet completely believable. Rain begins again during the afternoon. Thin at first, then harder. Water drips from your hood down the back of your neck while the cart rattles toward poorer neighbourhoods near the outer wall. Here the streets narrow further. Houses lean close together with sagging roofs and warped shutters. Smoke curls low from chimneys because damp wood burns badly. You smell cabbage soup, sewage, wet straw, and incense all at once. A woman runs after the cart, suddenly waving both arms. You tense instinctively, but she only begs for help moving her husband before nightfall. Her voice cracks from exhaustion more than panic. Thomas nods quietly and follows her inside. The husband proves younger than expected. That unsettles you too. Plague ignores the comfortable logic people prefer. It does not politely target only the old or weak. Healthy workers vanish within days. Priests, mothers, apprentices, bakers, labourers. The randomness frightens everyone most. By evening, the cart finally turns back toward the churchyard. Mud splashes against the wheels. The horse stumbles once but recovers. Smoke rises from scattered chimneys through deepening blue twilight, while bells echo faintly across distant streets. You look behind you at the silent shapes beneath rain-darkened linen. This morning each belonged to separate homes, separate lives, separate tables and conversations and worries. Now they travel together through mist toward the same ground. Thomas notices your expression. You stop counting after a while, he says softly. That thought settles heavily beside you during the ride home. Ahead, lanterns flicker near the graveyard gate, and somewhere beneath the wet earth waiting in darkness, space must somehow still be found. The dead arrive wrapped in linen, wool, and sometimes curtains. That is one of the stranger details you begin noticing after several days working beside the churchyard. Families use whatever cloth remains available. Fine blankets, old tunics, bits of household fabric pulled hastily from beds or walls. The plague does not wait politely while people search for matching burial materials. Tonight the air smells strongly of candle wax and wet stone. Rain finally stopped some time before dusk, leaving the streets slick beneath lantern light. Water still drips steadily from roof edges into the gutters below. You stand beside a wooden table near the chapel entrance while Thomas unties another length of cloth around a dead woman's wrists. The bells remain quiet for once. That silence feels temporary. A cool wind drifts through the churchyard carrying smoke from nearby chimneys and the faint scent of rosemary burning somewhere beyond the walls. People burn herbs constantly now. Rosemary, sage, juniper branches. Anything believed to cleanse foul air. Of course. Medieval towns already possessed many powerful smells long before the plague arrived. But fear has a way of turning ordinary odours into warnings. You help prepare the woman for burial beneath the flickering lantern. Her face appears peaceful in the uncertain light. Older than you expected. Fine lines beside her eyes. Grey hair carefully braided before death. Someone loved her enough to braid it. That thought settles quietly into your mind. Across Europe during the Black Death, many burial customs changed out of necessity, yet families still tried desperately to preserve dignity for the dead whenever possible. Even in overcrowded towns, relatives often washed bodies, wrapped them carefully, or included small personal objects before burial. The practical work itself moves slowly tonight. You fold linen across shoulders stiffened by cold. Thomas ties cloth gently beneath the chin so mouths remain closed during burial. Nearby, a young priest arranges candles along the chapel wall with tired concentration. The warm light softens the harshness of everything for a moment. Outside the churchyard gate, wheels rattle across stone. Another cart arriving. You barely react now. That realization unsettles you more than the carts themselves ever did. The chapel interior glows faint gold through narrow windows while the priest murmurs prayers over a boy laid near the altar. His mother kneels beside him, clutching a small leather pouch. She whispers continuously into folded hands. Maybe prayers, maybe memories, maybe bargaining. Human beings become extremely creative negotiators when frightened. You notice coins resting over the boy's closed eyes. Not everyone follows this custom, but some families still do. The practice stretches far older than Christianity itself, echoing ancient traditions meant to prepare souls for the journey beyond death. Medieval Europe mixed official religion with layers of older folk customs in ways both fascinating and deeply confusing. One baker's wife tells you later that garlic tied around the neck protects corpses from restless spirits. Another man insists silver bells buried with the dead can prevent wandering souls from returning home. You privately suspect medieval people would have attached bells to absolutely anything if given the opportunity. The night grows colder. Your fingers ache while working with wet cloth and rough rope. Lantern smoke stings your eyes. Somewhere above the clouds, the moon briefly appears between drifting gaps before vanishing again. Near midnight, Thomas sends you into town carrying a bundle of clean linen borrowed from abandoned homes. Borrowed feels like a generous description, but plague years rearrange ordinary morality in uncomfortable ways. Empty houses become storage spaces. Unclaimed goods quietly circulate among survivors. The streets feel eerie after dark. Most windows remain shuttered tight. A few glow faintly behind waxcloth curtains. Somewhere distant, somebody coughs continuously through the night. You hear cats fighting near the tannery district and the low splash of river water against wooden docks. Then you notice the smell. Lavender, strong enough to overpower even the damp odour of the streets. You follow it toward a narrow doorway where bundles of herbs hang above the entrance. Inside, an elderly woman crushes flowers into tiny cloth pouches beside a smoking fire. She glances up calmly when you enter. "Gravedigger," she says. Not a question. You nod. Without another word, she hands you one of the little lavender bundles. "For sleep," she explains. You almost laugh at the idea of restful sleep existing anywhere in this town. Still, you tuck the pouch into your cloak. Some contemporary chroniclers recorded that people carried sweet-smelling herbs, flowers, or vinegar-soaked cloths near their faces during plague outbreaks because many believed disease travelled through corrupted air called miasma. The theory proved incorrect scientifically, though avoiding foul, crowded spaces probably helped more than anyone realised. Before leaving, you notice dozens of candles burning around the woman's room despite the late hour. "Too dark otherwise," she mutters. You understand what she means. Darkness feels heavier lately. When you return to the churchyard, Thomas and the priest prepare another burial beneath the chapel awning. Rainwater drips steadily from the roof edge beside them. The priest's voice has grown hoarse from endless prayers. You help lower the body carefully into a narrow grave already half filled with water at the bottom. Nobody comments on it. Mud presses heavily around your boots while cold wind moves through the leaning grave markers. The lantern light catches tiny droplets across the cemetery until every cross and stone seems edged in gold. For one strange moment, the churchyard almost looks beautiful. Then the bells begin again. Slow, distant, unmistakable. A servant approaches through the fog carrying news from the southern district. More deaths during the evening. More carts expected by morning. Thomas closes his eyes briefly after hearing this. Not dramatic despair, just exhaustion. You both return to work silently. The graves continue filling one by one beneath flickering lanterns while clouds drift low above the church tower. Your shoulders burn from lifting bodies and digging wet soil. Candlelight sways across linen wrappings pale as river stones. At some point during the long cold hours before dawn, you realise something peculiar. The dead themselves frighten you less now than the living, not because people have become cruel exactly. Most remain ordinary, grieving, tired, hungry, but fear changes communities in subtle ways. Neighbours avoid eye contact. Families whisper behind locked doors. Every cough becomes suspicious. Every stranger feels dangerous. Some researchers today still dispute how much panic truly dominated medieval plague towns versus how much later writers exaggerated the chaos. Standing here in the freezing dark beside another open grave, you suspect reality sat somewhere in between. Not endless screaming madness, not calm acceptance either. Just thousands of exhausted people trying to survive one more week. Dawn slowly approaches behind thick clouds. The candles burn lower beside the chapel wall. Wet earth clings to your boots nearly to the ankle. Somewhere nearby, the lavender pouch inside your cloak releases faint sweetness each time you move, and beneath the churchyard's soil, the town continues growing quieter one grave at a time. The rumours spread faster than the carts. You notice this gradually over the following days as the town grows colder and quieter beneath low grey skies. Fear moves through streets in ways no shovel can bury. It slips beneath doors, travels between market stalls, settles beside fires at night. By now, every person seems to carry a different explanation for why the plague arrived, and every explanation sounds certain. You stand near the cemetery wall early one morning, scraping mud from your boots with a broken piece of wood, while two women argue beside the gate. One insists poisoned wells caused the sickness. The other swears travelling merchants brought cursed fabrics from distant ports. Neither sounds fully convinced by her own theory. That may be the strangest part. The human mind dislikes empty spaces. When answers vanish, people begin filling silence with stories. A chilly fog hangs low over the churchyard while ravens pick through puddles near fresh graves. The ground has become uneven from constant burial work. Water gathers in shallow depressions between mounds of dark soil. Everywhere you step, your boots sink slightly into earth that no longer has time to settle properly. Martin arrives carrying 2 shovels over one shoulder. You hear the newest one, he asks. You already know there will be a newest one. He lowers his voice anyway. Some say the stars changed. You blink at him. The stars. He nods seriously. According to the latest theory drifting through town, strange alignments in the heavens poisoned the air months before the sickness appeared. Several educated medieval scholars genuinely explored connections between astronomy and disease because celestial events were often believed to influence earthly health and behaviour. To be fair, modern people still blame random planetary behaviour for surprisingly large portions of their lives. You follow Martin toward the far edge of the cemetery where fresh digging waits beside the boundary wall. Frost glitters faintly across patches of grass untouched by footsteps. The cold air smells sharp and metallic, mixed with chimney smoke drifting from the town below. As you dig, church bells echo across rooftops through the mist. Not funeral bells this time. Warning bells! A cart carrying supplies overturned near the market square, and frightened townsfolk immediately assumed contaminated goods were spilling into the streets. By the time you hear the full story, the entire event turns out to involve cabbages and one very confused donkey. Still, panic lingers long after facts disappear. That happens often now. At midday, you walk into town beside Thomas carrying empty linen bundles. The streets appear busier than usual, though not in a comforting way. Small groups whisper together near wells and corners. Several shopkeepers burn herbs outside their doors. One man has hung tiny silver charms across his windows to repel evil influences. A physician passes wearing a long robe and carrying bundles of dried plants. He smells strongly of vinegar. People step aside nervously as he moves through the crowd. Medical knowledge during the Black Death mixed practical observation, religious belief, and deeply questionable ideas into one complicated system. Some healers recommended fresh air and isolation. Others prescribed bloodletting or strange herbal mixtures. Many treatments accomplished little except making already miserable patients additionally inconvenienced. Near the bread market, you encounter a travelling storyteller speaking loudly to gathered listeners. His boots are soaked. His beard looks damp enough to host small wildlife. "The river's accursed," he declares dramatically. A woman nearby crosses herself. Another man mutters that foreigners poisoned the wells. Thomas stiffens beside you. These rumours carry danger. In several regions during the plague years, frightened populations blamed outsiders, travellers, minorities, or neighbouring communities for the spread of disease. Fear often searched desperately for someone visible to punish. You notice how quickly crowds lean towards certainty whenever simple explanations appear. It is comforting, perhaps, to believe disaster always has a clear villain. The storyteller lowers his voice for dramatic effect. Some swear they've seen pale spirits walking above the burial pits after midnight. That finally earns your attention, not because you believe him exactly, mostly because you now spend enough time near burial pits to feel professionally entitled to updates regarding local ghost activity. The crowd murmurs uneasily. One old man insists lights have floated through the cemetery fog at night. A woman claims bells rang from the abandoned chapel outside town despite nobody being there. Scholarly opinions remain divided about how widespread supernatural interpretations became during the plague years, though surviving accounts suggest fear intensified belief in omens, visions, and spiritual warnings across many communities. Honestly, if you spent every day surrounded by death carts, bells, fog, and exhausted priests whispering beside graves, you might start suspecting ghosts too. By afternoon, clouds darken again overhead. You return to the churchyard carrying bread, lamp oil, and 2 tiny herb bundles purchased from the lavender woman. Martin scoffs when he sees them. Think flowers stop plague. No, you answer, but they smell better than this place. For the first time in days, he laughs. Only briefly, but still. Rain begins once more while you work beside the northern graves. The soil there has grown softer than elsewhere. Each shovel sinks deep with wet sucking sounds. Water drips steadily from your hood onto your hands. Then you uncover something unexpected. Wood. Not a coffin exactly, more likely old burial remains from years earlier. Martin kneels beside the exposed boards with tired resignation. No room, he mutters quietly. That phrase again. No room. In overcrowded medieval burial grounds, older graves were sometimes disturbed unintentionally or reopened earlier than intended due to lack of space. Churchyards designed for ordinary mortality simply could not absorb plague numbers indefinitely. Together you cover the remains carefully before continuing elsewhere. The rain grows heavier toward evening. Lanterns flicker across the cemetery through drifting mist while distant thunder rolls beyond the hills. A priest hurries between graves, clutching his cloak tight against the wind. Near the gate, mourners argue softly about burial placement, while horses stamp nervously in the mud. The whole town feels stretched thin now, like cloth worn nearly transparent. After sunset, you sit beneath the toolshed awning sharing weak ale with Thomas and Martin, while rain rattles against wooden boards overhead. Martin tells the story quietly. Years ago, before the plague, a drunken baker supposedly wandered into the cemetery at night after losing a wager. He claimed the statues moved when moonlight touched them. Thomas snorts. The statues did not move. Martin shrugs. The baker did fall into an open grave, though. That sounds much more believable. The 3 of you sit listening to rain for a while afterward. No bells, no carts, just water falling steadily over graves and rooftops. For one peaceful moment, the town almost feels normal again. Then somewhere beyond the walls, faint and distant through the storm, a woman begins screaming for a priest. The sound carries clearly through the dark. Nobody at the toolshed speaks, slowly. With the weary movements of men already knowing how the night will end, you stand together and reach once more for lanterns and shovels. The rain does not stop for 4 days. At first it seems manageable. Just another cold drizzle soaking cloaks and turning streets slick beneath wagon wheels. Medieval towns are already familiar with mud. Nobody here expects clean boots or dry socks. But as the days drag onward, the earth itself begins changing beneath your feet. The graveyard softens, then sinks, then slowly transforms into something closer to a swamp with religious ambitions. You stand ankle-deep in mud near the eastern wall before sunrise while rainwater drips steadily from the tip of your hood. Every grave around you looks darker now. The soil no longer piles neatly beside trenches. Instead, it collapses inward, sliding heavily back into holes almost as quickly as you dig them. Martin curses under his breath while trying to free a stuck shovel. That one belongs to the ground now, Thomas mutters. Honestly, the earth has earned it. Cold rain rattles softly across grave markers and chapel stones. Water streams through narrow channels between burial mounds, carrying bits of leaves, straw, and loose soil downhill toward the gate. The cemetery smells stronger than usual. Wet clay, rotting wood, smoke drifting from the town, damp wool, everything heavy with moisture. A number of surviving medieval accounts describe terrible weather-worsening conditions during plague outbreaks. Heavy rains flooded burial grounds, collapsed trenches, and made transporting bodies vastly harder. Reading about this centuries later sounds unpleasant enough. Living inside it feels like wrestling an angry river using only a shovel and personal disappointment. You spend most of the morning repairing graves damaged by erosion. One mound near the chapel partially caved in overnight. Another fills steadily with rainwater despite your efforts to drain it. The work becomes less about proper burial and more about preventing the churchyard from sliding downhill entirely. At midday, thunder rolls above the town. The sound echoes strangely through the mist while black clouds swallow what little daylight remains. A horse pulling one of the burial carts panics suddenly near the gate, nearly overturning the entire load into the mud. Thomas grabs the reins while two priests rush forward, splashing through puddles. The horse eventually calms, though it continues trembling afterward. You understand the feeling. Rainwater drips from your sleeves while you help stabilize the cartwheels with broken boards and loose stones. The dead beneath the coverings remain silent through all of it. In a strange way, they are the calmest part of the cemetery now. A widow arrives during the storm carrying a lantern hidden beneath her cloak. She insists her husband deserves burial near the church steps despite the flooding. The priest apologizes gently, explaining that area is no longer safe for digging. She begins crying anyway, not loudly, just quiet, exhausted tears slipping down a rain-soaked face while thunder mutters overhead. You look away to give her privacy. One detail often overlooked in popular stories about the Black Death is how physically exhausting grief became. Families still carried water, baked bread, repaired roofs, and searched for food while mourning loved ones. Sorrow did not pause ordinary survival. The widow eventually places a tiny candle beside a nearby cross before leaving through the rain. The flame survives only a few moments. By afternoon, the churchyard resembles a battlefield abandoned after terrible weather. Deep footprints fill instantly with water. Shovels sink sideways into softened ground. Wooden grave markers lean at exhausted angles. And still the carts keep arriving. You work beside a younger labourer named Etienne today because Martin's cough worsened overnight. Etienne talks too much, which under normal circumstances might become irritating. But after weeks surrounded by bells and grief, endless chatter feels oddly comforting. He claims frogs gathering near wells predict more rain. He also claims monks in another town attempted curing plague with powdered emeralds mixed into wine. You stare at him. Did it work? Etienne shrugs. Probably not, but perhaps the wine helped. Fair point. Across medieval Europe, desperate remedies flourished during plague years. Some involved herbs or isolation practices with occasional practical value. Others wandered confidently into the territory of complete nonsense. Crushed gemstones, strange tonics, magical symbols painted on walls. Human beings become wonderfully inventive when terrified. Late in the afternoon, lightning flashes somewhere beyond the hills. For a heartbeat, the entire cemetery glows white. Every cross, every puddle, every rain-soaked grave. Then darkness again. Etienne crosses himself quickly. Nearby, two priests argue quietly beneath the chapel awning. One believes the flooding graves should be relocated beyond town walls immediately. The other insists abandoning sacred ground risks spiritual consequences for the dead. Modern historians remain divided on how consistently church authorities adapted burial practices during severe plague waves. Some communities adjusted quickly out of necessity. Others resisted changes despite worsening conditions. You suspect everyone is simply improvising now? The storm intensifies after sunset. Rain hammers rooftops so hard conversation becomes difficult. Water pours down narrow lanes through town like shallow rivers. Inside the tool shed, lantern light flickers across damp walls, while workers huddle around weak fires trying unsuccessfully to dry gloves and cloaks. Steam rises faintly from soaked clothing. Someone hands you hot onion broth in a cracked wooden bowl. It tastes mostly like salty rainwater and exhaustion. Yet the warmth spreads pleasantly through your hands while you drink. Outside, bells begin ringing again through the storm. A body arrived from the southern district. Then another. You return to the graveyard carrying lanterns shielded beneath wax cloth. Rain lashes sideways through freezing wind. Mud clings heavily to your boots until each step feels stolen from the earth by force. Near the northern wall, one grave has collapsed completely. For several long minutes, everyone simply stands staring at it beneath the rain. No anger, no panic, only tired disbelief. Then the work begins again. You shovel water aside while Thomas reinforces the trench using old boards scavenged from broken fencing. Priests mutter prayers through soaked sleeves. Lantern flames bend wildly in the wind. At some point during the chaos, you begin laughing quietly. Not because anything is funny exactly, just because the entire situation feels absurd beyond words. You're standing in a flooded medieval graveyard during a plague storm at midnight, attempting structural repairs with rotten lumber, while bells echo through the darkness like judgment itself. Somewhere in history books centuries from now, this will probably sound very dramatic. In reality, you're mostly cold. Hours later, the rain finally weakens. Not ending entirely, just softening into steady drizzle. Mist curls low across the graves while exhausted workers lean on shovels, catching breath. The church tower rises dark above the cemetery against moving clouds. Water drips endlessly from every surface. You look around at the ruined ground. Fresh graves, flooded trenches, bent crosses, lantern reflections trembling across puddles. And somehow, despite everything, the work continues. Because morning will come eventually. The carts will return, and the soaked earth beneath your boots will once again need to open itself for the dead. The priests begin disappearing quietly, not all at once. No dramatic moment where the church doors swing open and somebody announces the clergy have fallen. Instead, you notice small absences accumulating like dust. Father Aldrich stops appearing at dawn prayers. Then Brother Mathieu fails to arrive with the burial records. A young novice who once carried candles through the cemetery simply never returns after visiting the sick near the river quarter. The church bells still ring, but fewer voices answer them now. You stand beside the chapel steps one pale morning watching rainwater drip from stone gargoyles, while Thomas speaks in low tones with a thin priest named Luke. The priest's cheeks look hollow beneath his hood. His hand shakes slightly while turning pages inside the burial ledger. "Another 3 gone," Luke murmurs. Thomas nods without surprise. You have reached the stage of the plague where bad news no longer changes anyone's expression very much. Cold wind moves through the cemetery carrying the smell of damp earth and candle smoke. Above the churchyard wall, bare branches scrape softly against grey skies. Somewhere distant, a hammer strikes wood in slow, uneven rhythm. Another coffin being built. Though coffin sometimes means little more than rough boards nailed together by exhausted carpenters. Several chroniclers from plague years noted that clergy often faced especially high mortality because priests regularly visited infected homes to hear confessions and deliver final rites. Many remained beside the dying long after wealthier residents fled crowded towns. You begin understanding why the surviving priests look so tired all the time. Luke closes the ledger and sighs. There are not enough of us anymore. No one argues. Later that morning, you accompany him into town carrying a small lantern and a satchel filled with candles, prayer books, and folded linen cloths. The streets glisten beneath weak daylight after another night of rain. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys while market stalls sit half empty beneath soaked canvas coverings. A woman kneels outside a bakery whispering prayers into clasped hands. Nearby, Two children chase each other through puddles for a few brief moments before an older sister sharply pulls them indoors. Even now, life still leaks through the cracks sometimes. Luke walks slowly. You notice how often he pauses to cough. At the first house, a man lies feverish beneath wool blankets while family members crowd silently near the walls. The room smells strongly of vinegar and boiled herbs. Bundles of rosemary hang beside the bed. Candles flicker near a tiny painted saint nailed above the doorway. Luke kneels beside the man and begins praying softly. His voice changes while speaking the prayers, gentler somehow, calmer. You stand near the door holding the lantern while rain taps faintly against the shutters outside. The family watches Luke carefully, almost desperately, as though his presence alone keeps panic from swallowing the room entirely. One lesser-known detail from medieval plague accounts is how heavily communities depended on religious routine for emotional stability. Prayer services, bells, processions, and blessings created familiar structure during chaos. When priests themselves began dying, many towns felt spiritually untethered as well as physically endangered. After the prayers, the man's wife presses bread into Luke's hands despite clearly having little food herself. He tries refusing. She insists. Eventually he accepts with visible embarrassment. Outside again, the streets feel colder. You pass several houses marked with bits of cloth tied near the doors. Not official signs, just quiet warnings between neighbours, a red ribbon here, a strip of white linen there. Fear develops its own language. At midday, Luke brings you toward the southern district where another priest recently died. The chapel there stands nearly empty now except for flickering candles and stacks of untouched hymn books. Dust gathers across the benches. You help carry water while Luke speaks with a pair of frightened altar boys who cannot be older than 12. One keeps glancing nervously toward the side room where the dead priest still lies wrapped in linen awaiting burial. The younger boy whispers something about devils moving through the town at night. Luke gently corrects him. Still, after the boys leave, he stares silently toward the darkened window for a long moment. Even priests are human. A strange belief spreading through nearby villages claims church bells themselves can drive sickness away if rung often enough. Some communities ring them almost constantly despite storms and exhaustion. Others fear excessive bell ringing attracts divine anger instead. Human beings can debate absolutely anything given enough anxiety and limited sleep. By late afternoon, another funeral procession reaches the churchyard. Only 6 mourners follow this time. Weeks ago there might have been dozens. People fear crowds now, fear entering homes, fear touching shared objects, fear standing too close during prayers. The burial itself happens quickly beneath drifting fog. Luke speaks the rites while rubbing one hand absently against his chest as though trying to ease discomfort there. You notice Thomas watching him carefully too. Neither of you says anything. As twilight settles over the cemetery, Luke asks for help inside the chapel. The interior feels warmer than outside, but smells heavily of incense and melted wax. Candles flicker across painted saints darkened by centuries of smoke. Rainwater taps faintly against stained glass windows high above. You help rearrange benches for tomorrow's services. Or what remains of services. Attendance shrinks daily. Some residents avoid gatherings entirely. Others attend obsessively, desperate for reassurance. The church has become both refuge and danger simultaneously. Modern scholars continue debating how much trust ordinary people retained in religious institutions during the worst plague years. Some communities grew more devoted. Others became angry, fearful, or disillusioned when prayers failed to stop the deaths. You suspect most people simply swung between hope and exhaustion depending on the hour. Night settles fully outside. The chapel glows softly beneath rows of candles while distant bells echo across the town once more. Luke sits heavily on one of the benches after finishing the evening prayers. For the first time, he looks old. Not physically, perhaps. More like somebody carrying invisible weight pressing steadily downward. You ever think of leaving, you ask quietly? He smiles faintly. Every morning. Then after a pause. And every morning I stay. The answer lingers between you and the candlelight. Outside, cold mist drifts through the graveyard while fresh graves darken beneath the moonless sky. Somewhere beyond the walls, another cart rattles slowly over stone streets. More dead arriving, more prayers waiting. Luke eventually rises with tired effort and reaches for his cloak. Together you step back into the freezing night air where bells continue ringing softly through the fog, like distant voices refusing to surrender completely to silence. The burials outside the town walls begin after sunset. At first, people resist the idea fiercely. The dead belong in consecrated ground. The older residents insist, near the church, beneath proper prayers, inside familiar earth where generations already rest together. But the cemetery inside town can no longer keep pace. Too many graves, too much water, too little room. So now, under moonless skies and drifting fog, you carry lanterns beyond the gates toward open fields where fresh pits wait in silence. The night air feels colder outside the walls. You notice it immediately as the heavy wooden gate closes behind your group with a deep groan of iron hinges. The sounds of town soften at once. No barking dogs, no murmured prayers from narrow houses. Only wind moving through dead grass and the slow creak of cartwheels over muddy ground. Your lantern throws pale light across the road ahead. Beside you, Thomas walks wrapped tightly in his cloak while two younger labourers guide the burial cart behind him. Father Luke comes as well, despite his worsening cough. He carries a small wooden cross and a leather prayer book darkened by rain. Nobody speaks much during the journey. The fields beyond town stretch empty beneath low clouds. Frost glimmers faintly across patches of grass untouched by footsteps. In the distance, thin trees sway gently in the wind like dark figures moving through mist. You suddenly understand how easily ghost stories begin. A surviving account from plague years in northern Europe describes burial grounds established hurriedly outside city limits when churchyards became overcrowded. In several towns, workers dug long trenches beyond the walls both for practical reasons and because residents feared concentrated sickness within crowded neighbourhoods. Fear shapes geography surprisingly quickly. The burial site lies near an abandoned orchard. Most of the trees stand bare now, their branches twisted against the sky. Fallen apples rot unseen beneath wet grass while ravens shift along the upper limbs, watching your arrival with unsettling patience. The trench itself waits half completed, wide, dark, deep enough that lantern light struggles to reach the bottom clearly. You stop at the edge feeling cold wind against your face. Nobody ever truly gets used to this part. The younger labourers begin unloading bodies wrapped in linen and rough blankets. Their movements remain careful despite exhaustion. One mutters quiet prayers beneath his breath while working. Father Luke opens the prayer book. The pages flutter violently in the wind. You help lower the first body into the trench using ropes damp from mist. The sound of shifting earth echoes softly upward from below. Somewhere nearby, an owl calls once through the darkness. One peculiar countryside belief claims owls circling burial grounds carry messages between the living and dead. Another insists hearing an owl before dawn predicts another death within 3 days. Medieval Europe contained enough superstitions to fully occupy several deeply anxious grandmothers for eternity. Thomas notices you glancing toward the trees. "Only birds," he mutters. You nod. Still, you avoid looking too closely at the orchard afterward. As the night deepens, fog thickens across the fields until lanterns glow like floating amber circles suspended in darkness. Your boots crunch over frozen grass between trips to the cart. Breath rises pale before every face. The work here feels different from the churchyard burials. Inside town, families gather, candles burn beside graves, bells ring, names get spoken aloud. Out here, the night swallows everything quickly. You realize how much those little rituals mattered. Father Luke tries to recite prayers for each burial, but eventually necessity forces shorter blessings. His voice grows rough from cold air and exhaustion. At one point he grips the edge of the trench while coughing hard into his sleeve. Thomas steadies him quietly. No one comments on it. A number of historians continue debating whether mass burials during the Black Death always happened exactly as later artwork depicted them. Some images show enormous chaotic pits filled carelessly, yet archaeological evidence from several plague cemeteries suggests many communities still arrange bodies with surprising care despite overwhelming circumstances. Standing here beside the trench, you understand why that distinction matters. Even now, people still try. Bodies are laid gently when possible. Crosses whispered over them, hands folded, faces covered carefully against the cold. Human dignity survives in fragments. Around midnight, snow begins falling lightly through the fog. Tiny flakes drift across lantern light and settle over cloaks already stiff with frost. The fields grow strangely beautiful beneath it. Quiet, silver, almost peaceful if you forget where you are, which admittedly proves difficult while standing beside a trench full of plague victims. One of the younger labourers suddenly freezes. There, he whispers. Everyone turns. At the edge of the orchard, a pale shape moves briefly between trees. For one absurd heartbeat, nobody breathes. Then a goat wanders into view, chewing something thoughtfully. Thomas exhales sharply. Terrifying beast, he mutters. The labourers laugh harder than the joke deserves. Exhaustion does that to people. After enough cold nights and burial work, even frightened laughter feels precious. The snow continues falling. Father Luke eventually closes the prayer book because moisture has begun warping the pages. Instead, he recites from memory while standing beneath drifting flakes. His voice moves softly through the darkness, carried away by wind almost as soon as the words leave him. You wonder how many times he has spoken these same prayers lately. Hundreds, perhaps. More. The trench slowly fills, earth weights piled nearby beneath white dustings of snow. Shovels lean against the cart wheels. Lantern flames flicker weakly whenever the wind shifts direction. At one point, you pause long enough to stare back toward town. From this distance, only a few lights remain visible beyond the walls. The church tower rises dark against clouded sky. Bells no longer ring tonight. The silence feels enormous. Some medieval communities believed plague victims buried outside traditional church grounds might struggle spiritually in the afterlife. Others accepted emergency burial practices as unfortunate necessities during extraordinary times. The tension between fear and compassion appears everywhere now. You help spread the first layer of soil across the trench. The sound is softer than expected. Snow gathers slowly over disturbed earth while ravens watch from the orchard branches above. The younger labourers work in silence now, too tired even for conversation. By the time the burial finishes, dawn has begun faintly silvering the eastern horizon. The fog thins slightly across frozen fields. Your hands ache from cold despite wool gloves damp with melted snow. Father Luke looks pale enough to disappear into the morning mist entirely. The cart stands empty at last. Together you begin the slow walk back toward town. Behind you, the new burial ground rests quietly beneath snow and drifting fog beyond the walls, where most townspeople prefer not to look too carefully. But tomorrow night, you already know, the lanterns will return here again, and the orchard ravens will still be waiting. You stop noticing hunger first, not because food improves, quite the opposite. Meals become smaller, stranger, and increasingly forgettable as winter settles across the town. But exhaustion slowly overtakes appetite until your body treats eating less like pleasure and more like repairing damaged equipment, which, to be fair, accurately describes your current condition. This morning begins before sunrise inside the tool shed beside the cemetery wall. Frost coats the outside of the wooden door in pale silver patterns, while weak firelight flickers across the cramped interior. You wake beneath scratchy wool blankets with your boots still on because removing frozen footwear at night has recently begun feeling too ambitious. Nearby, Thomas snores softly against the wall. Someone else coughs in their sleep. The room smells of damp wool, smoke, mud, and onion broth lingering from last night's supper. Outside, bells ring faintly through freezing fog. You sit up slowly and immediately regret every life decision leading to this moment. Your shoulders ache from digging. Your hands feel permanently stiff now, the skin across your palms roughened and cracked from cold weather and wet tools. Even your knees hurt for reasons no medieval physician could probably explain beyond too much grave. A surviving household account from 14th century Europe notes that ordinary labourers during plague years often survived on coarse bread, thin ale, onions, cabbage soup, and whatever preserved food remained available during winter months. Wealthier tables occasionally offered meat or imported spices, though even nobles struggled when trade routes failed. Breakfast today consists of black bread hard enough to qualify as building material, and a wooden cup of weak ale slightly warmer than river water. You eat anyway. The body learns obedience during difficult seasons. Outside the tool shed, dawn barely touches the church tower through drifting grey mist. Frost crunches beneath your boots while ravens stalk between graves searching for scraps left by mourners. Thin smoke rises from town chimneys carrying the comforting smell of fires and cooking oats. For one quiet moment, the cemetery almost appears peaceful. Then the first cart arrives. Work begins immediately. You spend hours digging along the outer wall where the ground freezes harder each morning. The shovel jars painfully against buried stones beneath the soil. Every breath burns slightly in the cold air. Etienne works beside you today wearing 2 mismatched gloves and an expression suggesting he personally blames winter for everything wrong in Christendom. "Soup froze in the bowl last night," he mutters. You nod sympathetically. He pauses. "While I was eating it. That does sound inconvenient." A curious habit develops among the workers during these freezing weeks. Everyone carries little scraps of food constantly. Bread tucked into pockets, nuts hidden in gloves, tiny dried apples wrapped in cloth. Labour burns through energy quickly in the cold, and proper meal times become unreliable luxuries. At midday, Thomas shares smoked fish beside the cemetery gate while snow drifts lightly across the lane. The fish tastes aggressively salty, but after endless bread and onion broth it feels almost festive. Almost. One widow passing nearby pauses long enough to hand you a small honey cake before hurrying onward. You stare at it in genuine confusion. Acts of kindness feel strangely startling now. The honey cake proves tiny, dense, and probably expensive by local standards. Medieval sugar remains rare and costly in many regions, so honey provides most sweetness available to ordinary people. Etienne watches you carefully. "You're going to eat that." You break it into pieces instead. The 3 of you sit quietly chewing while snowflakes drift through the churchyard. No grand speeches, no emotional revelations, just tired men sharing precious sugar beside frozen graves. Some modern historians believe periods of labour shortage during the Black Death eventually improved conditions slightly for surviving workers in certain regions because demand for labour increased after so much population loss. But standing here today, freezing beside a cemetery wall while eating half a honey cake, the future still feels very far away. The afternoon brings more burials. Cold weather changes everything again. The ground grows stubborn. Lantern oil thickens in freezing air. Fingers lose feeling halfway through tying burial cloths. Even grief seems quieter in winter, muffled beneath layers of wool and drifting snow. You notice families lingering less during funerals now. Nobody wants to remain outdoors longer than necessary. Inside the chapel, however, warmth gathers around candles and crowded bodies. The scent of wax, smoke, and damp wool fills the air while priests whisper prayers over the dead. People press close together despite fear because winter leaves little choice. A strange rumour circulating through town claims eating roasted onions every morning prevents plague entirely. Another insists sleeping with bread beneath the pillow absorbs sickness from the body overnight. Etienne tried the bread method once. Unfortunately, rats appreciated the treatment more than his immune system did. As darkness falls, the cold sharpens further. You accompany Thomas through town, collecting bodies from several narrow streets near the Tanners district. Snow crunches beneath the cartwheels now instead of mud. Frozen puddles gleam beneath lantern light like black glass. Most houses stay shuttered tightly against the wind. Still, little signs of ordinary life persist. A woman sweeping snow from her doorway. A tailor mending gloves beside candlelight. The smell of garlic stew drifting from cracked shutters. You realise people are still trying very hard to remain human. At one house, an elderly man insists on giving you hot chestnuts before allowing the body inside to be carried away. He presses them into your frozen hands wrapped in cloth. For warmth, he says quietly. The chestnuts burn pleasantly against your palms. You eat them slowly while riding through the dark streets afterward. Soft, sweet, smoky from the fire. For several minutes, you think about nothing except warm food, and strangely that feels healing. Late in the evening, you return to the churchyard beneath clear skies for the first time in weeks. The clouds finally broke apart, revealing sharp winter stars overhead. Snow reflects pale moonlight across the graves until the cemetery glows softly blue and silver. Beautiful. Cold enough to freeze your lungs, perhaps, but beautiful. You pause beside the chapel steps, staring upward while your breath drifts into the night air. Some writers from the medieval period described plague years as spiritually disorienting, partly because ordinary patterns stopped making sense. Festivals disappeared. Markets failed. Familiar neighbours vanished. Yet nature continued calmly onward through all of it. Snow still fell, stars still appeared. The indifference unsettled people deeply. Behind you, Thomas exits the chapel carrying another lantern. "You sleeping tonight?" he asks. You consider the question honestly. Probably not much, but perhaps enough. Inside the tool shed, the fire crackles weakly while exhausted workers settle beneath blankets and cloaks. Somebody snores already. Someone else mutters prayers half asleep. You curl beneath rough wool, listening to wind scrape softly across the cemetery walls outside. Your stomach remains only half full. Your muscles ache. Your hands smell faintly of smoke and cold iron. Yet for the first time in many nights, warmth slowly spreads through your body while sleep approaches gently through the dark. The wealthy leave quietly, not all at once, not with dramatic speeches or trumpets or great lines of carriages rattling proudly through the gates. In fact, most departures happen before dawn while frost still clings to rooftops and the streets remain empty, except for gravediggers, priests, and the occasional miserable chicken. You notice the pattern gradually. Large houses near the market square stay dark longer each morning. Servants vanish from familiar errands. Windows once glowing warmly at supper now sit shuttered and cold. Then one afternoon you pass the merchant district and realise half the doors stand locked. Gone. The rich have retreated to country estates, manor houses, monasteries, or distant relatives wherever roads remain open enough to travel safely. Those with horses, coin, and influence place distance between themselves and crowded streets as quickly as possible. Unfortunately for everyone else, Plague does not issue refunds after departure. You walk beside Thomas through the thinning market crowds carrying burial cloths beneath a pale winter sky. Snow from earlier storms has hardened into dirty ridges along the road edges. Smoke hangs low between rooftops while icy wind slips through the narrow streets. The town sounds different lately. Less shouting, fewer carts, fewer arguments drifting from taverns. Even the dogs seem quieter. At the butcher's square, abandoned stalls sit beneath sagging canvas awnings stiff with frost. A single fish seller remains open despite the cold, muttering to himself while arranging tiny silver fish across crushed ice. Thomas points toward a large stone house overlooking the square. Goldsmith lived there. The windows stand boarded shut. Left 3 weeks ago. You stare at the empty building. One observation repeated across many plague-era records is that wealth often allowed mobility. Families with resources could sometimes escape crowded urban centres earlier than labourers or poorer residents tied to daily work, rents or obligations. Rural isolation did not guarantee safety, but many believed it improved survival chances. The people remaining inside town know this too. A bitterness has begun creeping into ordinary conversations. Near the well, two women whisper angrily about merchants abandoning apprentices. A cooper complains that nobles still demand rent despite entire households dying. Someone mutters that wealthy men fled while priests stayed. Nobody says these things loudly, but you hear them everywhere. At midday, you help carry a body from one of the richer districts near the eastern wall. The house itself remains impressive despite the cold emptiness inside. Carved wooden beams, coloured glass windows, fine wool curtains gathered against the draught, and silence. Most servants already left days earlier, according to the neighbour speaking nervously beside the doorway. Only the house steward remained to care for the old merchant after illness arrived. Now the steward is gone too. Inside, dust already settles across polished tables. The speed of abandonment unsettles you. A half-finished meal still rests beside the fireplace. Candles melted down to uneven stubs stand frozen in their holders. Upstairs, a child's wooden toy horse lies overturned beside a bed. Life interrupted halfway through ordinary moments. You help wrap the merchant carefully in linen while Thomas searches for documents or family instructions. None appear. Perhaps the relatives plan returning later. Perhaps not. As you carry the body downstairs, your boots echo through rooms built for laughter and business and winter feasts. Now only cold air answers. Outside, snow begins falling lightly again. Small flakes drift through the narrow lane while townspeople hurry past, avoiding eye contact with the death cart. A woman pulls her scarf tighter across her face. Two boys pause briefly to stare before being hurried away by an older brother. Fear changes cities physically, but it also changes posture. Everyone moves differently now, faster, narrower somehow, as though trying to occupy less space inside danger. By afternoon, the cemetery fills with smoke from dozens of nearby chimneys. The wind shifted, carrying the entire town's fires toward the churchyard. Your eyes sting while digging beside the northern graves. Etienne works nearby, complaining continuously about frozen soil. Ground's harder than cathedral bread, he mutters. You're not entirely certain cathedral bread deserves that insult, but the soil truly is terrible today. The shovel strikes frozen earth with dull cracking sounds. Each layer must be chipped loose carefully before digging continues. Your hands go numb despite wool wrappings beneath the gloves. During a short break, Luke joins you beside the toolshed fire. He looks thinner than before. You hear about Lord Berenger, Etienne asks. Luke nods once. Gone to the countryside. Etienne snorts. With 6 wagons and 3 cooks. Thomas shrugs from beside the fire. If I owned 6 wagons, I'd leave too. Honestly, difficult to argue there. Some accounts from plague years mention nobles attempting elaborate protective routines after fleeing towns. Certain households isolated themselves completely. Others banned outside visitors or ordered servants to cleanse goods with vinegar and smoke before entry. One particularly strange tale describes aristocrats carrying tiny bouquets of flowers constantly beneath their noses to defend against corrupted air. You quietly suspect the flowers mostly defended against unpleasant smells. As evening approaches, bells ring once from the southern quarter. Another death. The sound drifts softly through falling snow. You walk with Luke afterward toward the abandoned merchant house because relatives reportedly returned briefly to retrieve valuables before darkness. The streets grow dim beneath gathering twilight, while lanterns flicker weakly behind shuttered windows. When you arrive, only one servant remains outside loading chests onto a wagon. Silver dishes, cloth bundles, candlesticks carefully wrapped in wool. No family members in sight. The servant avoids your eyes. Luke says nothing either. The wagon eventually rattles away toward the western gate while snow collects across empty steps behind it. You stand together staring at the silent house. There are whole villages outside the town nearly empty now, Luke says quietly. You glance toward him. From deaths, from fear, the distinction matters. People are scattering. Some flee cities, others avoid markets entirely. Travellers sleep in barns rather than inns. Doors stay barred against neighbours once welcomed gladly inside. And yet plague follows roads, rivers, trade routes, and human breath with terrible patience. Back at the cemetery. Lanterns glow warmly through the deepening snow while workers finish evening burials. The graves look softer tonight beneath fresh white layers settling over crosses and disturbed soil. Beautiful again in that uncomfortable way winter sometimes manages. You pause beside the chapel wall watching snowflakes drift through the lantern light. Somewhere beyond town walls, wealthy families sit beside roaring fires inside distant manor houses hoping distance will protect them. Meanwhile here, inside the cold cemetery, the shovels continue rising and falling steadily through frozen ground. Because the dead still arrive, and someone always remains behind to bury them, the children begin appearing alone. At first you tell yourself there must be parents nearby. An older sister fetching water perhaps. A grandmother delayed at market. Somebody just out of sight behind the next doorway. But after enough weeks in the plague town, you stop pretending every child wandering the streets belongs to someone still living. The realization settles slowly and heavily into the bones. This morning the sky hangs pale and colourless above the rooftops, while thin frost glitters across the cemetery wall. Smoke rises straight upward for once because the wind finally rests. The quiet feels fragile, like ice over deep water. You carry lantern oil through the market lane when you first notice the boy. He sits beside the dry fountain near the square, wrapped in a cloak far too large for him. Maybe 8 years old, thin face, red hands tucked beneath his arms against the cold, and no adult nearby. People pass him carefully without stopping. Not cruelly exactly, more uncertainly. Everyone fears everyone now. You slow your steps. The boy watches you with the exhausted caution of someone learning too early that adults rarely bring good news anymore. You lost, you ask. He shrugs. That answer tells you everything. Across Europe during the plague years, many children lost one or both parents in astonishingly short periods of time. Surviving records mention overcrowded orphan houses in some cities, while in smaller towns children were sometimes absorbed into neighbouring households, monasteries, workshops, or simply left to survive however they could. The boy says his name is Peter. His mother died 3 nights earlier, his father before that. He says it plainly, almost mechanically, as though repeating information too often spoken already. You kneel beside him while market bells ring faintly overhead. When did you eat last? Another shrug. Wonderful, a medieval child communicating exclusively through despair and shoulder movements. You eventually lead him toward the bakery near the southern lane where the owner still sells coarse rye bread each morning. The baker's wife eyes the boy nervously at first before softening slightly when she notices how badly his hands shake from cold. She gives him warm broth without asking payment. The smell fills the tiny shop immediately. Onion, garlic, thin cabbage stock. Peter grips the bowl like treasure. One small but touching pattern appears again and again in accounts from plague periods. Alongside fear and suspicion, there are also quiet moments of generosity. Neighbours sharing bread. Monasteries sheltering abandoned children. Bakers leaving food outside doors. Human kindness survives stubbornly even during catastrophe. Outside, snow melts slowly from rooftops beneath weak winter sunlight. You bring Peter back toward the churchyard because there are few other places left to take him. The chapel still shelters several displaced children alongside widows and elderly residents too frightened to remain alone. The cemetery feels calmer today. No carts yet, only crows hopping between grave markers and Thomas repairing broken wooden crosses beside the northern wall. He glances up when you arrive with the boy. Another one. The words remain unspoken. Inside the chapel, warmth gathers around candles burning near the altar. 3 children sit bundled beneath blankets near the side wall, while an elderly nun distributes chunks of bread from a basket. The youngest girl clutches a wooden doll missing one arm. Peter joins them cautiously. No introductions necessary. Children adapt to strange circumstances with alarming speed. The nun thanks you quietly before returning to her work. Her hands move slowly from arthritis and cold, but her eyes remain sharp. She lost 2 sisters last month, Thomas whispers after she walks away. You nod. Everyone here carries grief now the way people carry cloaks in winter. Constantly, without discussion. Later that afternoon, you accompany Luke to a narrow house near the river quarter, where another family fell sick overnight. The streets there smell strongly of damp wood and smoke from burning peat. Laundry hangs frozen stiff between buildings above your head. Inside the house, 2 little girls sit silently near the fireplace while their older brother attempts cooking something resembling soup. Attempting is perhaps generous. The pot emits an alarming smell, suggesting the cabbage fought bravely before surrendering. Luke kneels beside the children, gently asking where their mother rests. The oldest points upstairs without speaking. You stay below while Luke climbs the stairs carrying candles and prayer books. The younger girl stares at your shovel leaning beside the door. Are you the grave man, she asks. Not gravedigger, not burial worker. The grave man. You realise suddenly that this is how many children know you now. Yes, you answer softly. She nods as though confirming something important. Then she offers you half a burnt potato from the soup pot. Honestly, under normal circumstances, you might decline food cooked by unsupervised medieval children during a plague winter. But the gesture feels sacred somehow. So you eat the potato. It tastes terrible. You thank her anyway. Outside again. Afternoon light fades early beneath gathering clouds. Thomas waits beside the cart while snowmelt drips steadily from roof edges around the lane. Children, he asks quietly. You nod once. Neither of you speaks further. A curious belief spreading among some townsfolk claims children survive plague more often because heaven protects innocence. Others argue the opposite, insisting young souls are more vulnerable to wandering spirits during epidemics. Mostly, you suspect frightened adults simply search for patterns wherever possible. As evening approaches, the chapel grows crowded. More children arrive with neighbours or distant relatives. Some cry quietly during prayers. Others sleep immediately from exhaustion curled beneath blankets near the altar steps. One boy spends an hour carving tiny animals into scraps of wood using a kitchen knife too large for him. The normal rhythms of childhood continue strangely even here. Games, hunger, sleepiness, curiosity. A little girl asks whether gravediggers ever bury dragons. Etienne tells her only on Thursdays. You are beginning to suspect Etienne should not supervise children unsupervised. Night settles outside while candles flicker warmly across chapel walls darkened by smoke and age. The children gradually drift asleep one by one beneath patched blankets. Luke coughs repeatedly through evening prayers now. The sound worries you more each day. Afterward, you help carry extra firewood inside while snow begins falling lightly beyond the stained glass windows. The chapel feels almost peaceful for the first time in weeks. Quiet breathing, soft crackling fire, candlelight shimmering across old stone. Peter already sleeps beside the younger children, clutching a wool blanket tightly beneath his chin. You stand watching them for a moment. Then you realize something unexpected. The cemetery no longer feels like only a place of death. Somehow, slowly, awkwardly, it has also become shelter. Outside, bells ring once through the snowy dark while cold wind moves softly across the graves. But inside the chapel, beneath candlelight and drifting wood smoke, a handful of children sleep safely through the winter night. And tonight, at least, that feels like enough. The fires begin appearing before dusk. At first, only a few burn near the market square where physicians and priests encourage people to cleanse the air with smoke and strong scents. Small piles of rosemary branches crackle beside doorways. Vendors throw sage and juniper onto glowing coals while thick grey clouds drift through the streets. Soon nearly every neighbourhood keeps fires burning. Some are practical, some are desperate. Most are both. You step from the chapel one evening and immediately smell smoke thick enough to sting your throat. The entire town seems wrapped inside a hazy grey veil beneath the winter sky. Bonfires flicker at intersections while shadows dance across snow-crusted walls. For one strange moment, the plague town resembles a festival viewed through exhausted eyes. Then the bells ring again. Thomas hands you a cloth soaked lightly in vinegar before you leave the churchyard. Helps with the smell, he says. You press it near your face cautiously. Your eyes water instantly. Also removes eyebrows, Etienne mutters nearby. Despite the joke, many people truly believe strong odours protect against sickness. Physicians often recommend sweet herbs, vinegar cloths, incense, and smoke because disease is widely associated with foul or corrupted air. Some treatments accidentally encourage useful habits like avoiding crowded filth. Others mostly create very fragrant misery. Tonight you accompany Luke through the western quarter carrying lanterns and bundles of dried herbs for households requesting blessings. Snow crunches beneath your boots while smoke drifts low between buildings. Children dart around one of the bonfires laughing briefly before their mother scolds them indoors. The sound startles you. Laughter has become rare enough to feel almost suspicious. Near the cooper's workshop, townspeople gather around a barrel fire throwing handfuls of herbs into the flames. Sparks rise upward through the dark while smoke curls thickly around their faces. An old man swears cedar smoke kept his cousin alive during an earlier fever outbreak decades ago. Another woman insists burning lavender drives sickness from houses. A third claims carrying roasted orange peels inside clothing prevents infection entirely. You privately suspect medieval medicine would have benefited greatly from slightly fewer conversations beginning with my cousin swore. Still, the fires comfort people. That matters too. Luke pauses outside a narrow house where smoke pours heavily from every window crack. Inside, the family burns herbs in iron pans near each doorway. The air smells so strong your head begins aching almost immediately. Rosemary, garlic, sage, something bitter beneath it all. The father explains proudly that he sealed every window with cloth to keep plague air outside. Unfortunately, he has also transformed the house into a boiling herb prison. Luke blesses the home politely while trying not to cough. Outside again. Freezing night air feels wonderfully clean by comparison. Across several medieval towns, records mention large public fires maintained during epidemics because authorities believed warm, fragrant smoke purified dangerous atmospheres. In some places, people were even instructed to carry flowers or aromatic bundles while walking through crowded streets. You begin wondering whether entire cities simply smelled like aggressive soup during plague winters. As the evening deepens, the fires grow brighter. Bonfires crackle near wells and crossroads while drifting sparks rise into black skies above the rooftops. Smoke softens the outlines of buildings until the town seems half hidden inside a dream, or perhaps a warning, near the tanner's lane. You pass a group of men carrying torches and chanting prayers beneath their breath. They move slowly between houses, sprinkling holy water along doorways, while residents watch nervously from windows. Etienne joins you there carrying extra lamp oil. They say smoke keeps evil spirits away too, he says. Does it? He shrugs. Can't hurt. Honestly, after months burying plague victims in frozen ground, your standards for acceptable medical logic have lowered considerably. At the next street corner, a bonfire burns enormous and bright enough to warm half the district. Townspeople cluster around it holding hands near the flames despite the cold. Faces glow gold in the firelight. For a few moments people talk almost normally again. Someone shares chestnuts roasting beside the coals. A baker passes around scraps of sweet bread left from the morning batch. One elderly woman begins humming softly while warming her hands. The scene feels strangely human. Disaster never fully erases ordinary behaviour. Even surrounded by fear, people still gather around warmth, still trade stories, still complain about weather and burned food and aching feet. A physician passes through the crowd wearing gloves scented heavily with herbs. His long cloak smells of camphor and smoke. Several residents immediately begin asking questions about cures. He recommends avoiding cold damp air, drinking diluted wine, and maintaining cheerful thoughts whenever possible. Cheerful thoughts. A bold strategy for a plague winter cemetery town. Some written accounts from the period suggest emotional states were sometimes linked to physical health in medieval medicine. Excessive sadness, fear, or stress were believed capable of weakening the body and making illness more likely. Considering your current occupation, this information feels deeply unhelpful. Snow begins falling lightly near midnight. The flakes drift slowly through rising smoke while the bonfires hiss and crackle beneath them. Ash swirls through the air like dark snow mixing with white. You return briefly to the churchyard carrying extra firewood for the chapel. The cemetery glows faintly beneath scattered lanterns and drifting smoke from nearby streets. Even here, someone has lit a small cleansing fire near the gate using rosemary and pine branches. The scent follows you everywhere now. Inside the chapel, warmth and smoke wrap together beneath the wooden beams overhead. Children sleep beside the fire while the old nun stirs a pot of onion broth near the hearth. Peter looks up sleepily when you enter. "Town smells strange tonight," he says. You laugh quietly. "Yes," you answer, "very strange." Later you step outside once more while carrying ashes from the chapel hearth. The night has grown still. All across the town, fires burn in the darkness. Tiny glowing points scattered between roofs and alleys and frozen streets. Smoke rises gently into the winter sky where stars appear faint behind drifting clouds. For one beautiful moment, the town almost resembles a field of lanterns floating against the snow. Then the wind shifts. The smell reaches you again beneath the rosemary and cedar and smoke. Wet earth, cold graves. The quiet reminder of why all these fires burn in the first place. Somewhere beyond the walls, another burial trench waits beneath frozen ground. Somewhere inside the town, another family sits beside another bed listening to another difficult cough. Still the bonfires crackle warmly through the night, and beneath their flickering light, frightened people continue trying with all their strength to push darkness back a little farther from the door. By now, every gravedigger in town carries something strange. Not tools. Everyone carries tools, shovels, ropes, lanterns, thick gloves, stiff with frozen mud. Those are ordinary. The strange things are smaller. Tiny charms sewn into sleeves, dried herbs tucked inside boots, coins rubbed smooth from nervous fingers. You notice them gradually during the long winter nights while standing beside graves beneath lantern light. Etienne keeps a rabbit's foot tied beneath his belt. Thomas carries a bent silver ring he claims belonged to his mother. One labourer from the river district refuses to work unless a sprig of rosemary hangs from his collar. Nobody laughs much about these habits anymore. Fear turns superstition respectable surprisingly quickly. Tonight the cemetery lies silent beneath clear skies and hard frost. Snow along the grave paths crunches sharply beneath your boots, while moonlight glows pale across rows of crosses and tilted stones. Cold enough that every breath feels carved from glass. You arrive near the tool shed to find Etienne heating wine beside a tiny fire protected between stacked bricks. Steam curls upward, carrying scents of cloves and smoke. "You look frozen," he says. You are frozen. The wine helps slightly. Warmth spreads slowly through your hands while the fire crackles against the darkness around you. Nearby, the chapel windows glow softly amber where candles still burn beside sleeping children. Thomas joins you carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "What's that?" Etienne asks. "Protection." Inside the cloth rests a tiny carved saint darkened by age. Etienne raises an eyebrow. "You suddenly holy—" "No," Thomas says calmly, suddenly cautious. "Fair enough." In difficult times, ordinary objects often gain emotional power far beyond their practical value. Archaeologists examining plague-era sites have uncovered charms, religious tokens, rings, and small household items apparently kept close for comfort or protection during outbreaks. People want something solid to hold when the world stops making sense. A bell rings faintly somewhere beyond the northern wall. Work calls again. You follow Thomas and Etienne toward the burial trench outside town, carrying lanterns through brittle, frozen grass. Frost sparkles across the fields beneath moonlight while distant trees stand black against the snow. The orchard ravens are already waiting. That feels less comforting than it should. As you walk, Etienne talks quietly about an old woman near the Western Quarter who claims plague spirits hate iron nails. According to her, hammering nails into door frames confuses evil forces and prevents them entering homes. Does it work, you ask? She's still alive. A surprisingly effective argument. The trench tonight sits hard and silent beneath frozen earth. Digging becomes slower during these colder weeks because the upper soil freezes solid overnight. Every strike of the shovel sends painful vibrations through your arms. Thomas spits into his gloves for warmth. It does not seem medically ideal. You lower another lantern beside the trench while snow squeaks softly beneath your boots. The bodies arrive wrapped tightly against the cold, frost already gathering across linen coverings before burial even begins. One young labourer pauses before climbing into the trench. He touches a small wooden cross hanging beneath his shirt first. Quickly, almost secretly, "You realise everyone has rituals now?" Tiny repeated gestures against helplessness. Crossing oneself before lifting bodies, touching charms before entering burial pits, avoiding certain paths through the cemetery after midnight. One particularly stubborn rumour insists whistling near graves attracts wandering souls. Etienne tested this once after too much ale, and spent the entire following week convinced something invisible followed him through town. Thomas claims the invisible presence was probably just guilt and terrible digestion. The burial continues beneath silver moonlight. No winter night, no rain, only the soft scrape of shovels and the distant creaking of bare tree branches. Father Luke arrives late carrying candles sheltered beneath his cloak. His cough worsens in the cold air now, rough enough that you occasionally see him pause to steady himself before speaking prayers. Still he comes. The candle flames tremble faintly while he blesses the graves. At some point during the night, conversation drifts toward older burial customs. Thomas remembers his grandmother placing salt beneath windows whenever someone died. Etienne says people in his village covered mirrors after funerals so trapped spirits could not linger inside reflections. You ask if he actually believes these things. He thinks for a moment, then shrugs. Believing is not always the point. The answer stays with you. Maybe the rituals matter because they create order, a little structure around fear. Tiny ceremonies reminding people they can still do something, even if that something involves suspicious amounts of rosemary and oddly positioned salt. The moon climbs higher overhead. Frozen grass crackles softly beneath every step while the trench slowly fills. Lantern light catches drifting frost in the air until the entire field seems dusted with floating silver. Beautiful again. Plague winters contain too many beautiful moments for comfort. During a short break, you sit beside the cart eating cold bread while Etienne sharpens shovel edges using a whetstone. Sparks jump briefly into the dark each time metal scrapes stone. From somewhere beyond the orchard comes the faint sound of singing. Everyone freezes. The singing drifts softly through the night wind, thin, distant, almost unreal. Then Thomas exhales. "Monks," he says. Sure enough, several lanterns soon appear moving slowly along the distant road. A small group of travelling monks passes through the fields chanting prayers while heading toward another village. Their voices echo faintly across the frozen landscape long after the lights disappear. You realise how enormous the world still is beyond this town. Other villages, other cemeteries, other frightened people standing beside fires and graves beneath the same winter sky. The thought feels oddly comforting. Near dawn, the burial finally ends. Snow begins falling again in tiny glittering flakes while workers smooth frozen soil across the trench. Father Luke's candles burn low beside the orchard trees. Before leaving, Thomas presses his silver ring briefly against the wooden cross at the trench edge. Not prayer exactly. Not magic either. Just memory, perhaps. You touch the lavender pouch still hidden inside your cloak. The scent faded weeks ago, but you carry it anyway. Around you, the others gather lanterns and tools. Rabbit's feet, tiny saints, coins, rings, little rituals tucked quietly into cold hands and patched clothing. None of it stops the plague. Still, somehow, These small, strange habits help people walk back into the darkness each night and continue the work waiting there. And for now, that is enough. Winter finally hardens the ground completely, not gently either. One morning you step into the cemetery before dawn and the earth sounds different beneath your boots. No soft mud, no wet, sucking footsteps. Everything rings sharp and solid in the freezing air. The graveyard has turned to stone. Your breath drifts pale beneath the lantern glow while frost coats every cross and grave marker in silver-white crystal. Even the ropes hanging beside the tool shed feel stiff as wood. Thomas strikes the ground once with his shovel. The sound echoes like iron hitting a wall. Nobody says anything for several long seconds. Then Etienne mutters, "Wonderful." The word freezes instantly between all of you. By now the plague has lasted long enough that each season creates new problems. Autumn flooded the graves. Winter seals them shut. The dead continue arriving regardless of weather, which feels deeply inconsiderate from a scheduling perspective. You spend the first hours of mourning trying to break frozen soil with iron picks instead of shovels. Every strike sends vibrations painfully through your arms and shoulders. Chips of ice-coated earth scatter across the snow, while the cold air burns inside your lungs. Several burial grounds across medieval Europe face similar difficulties during severe winters. Contemporary descriptions mention workers struggling for hours to open graves in frozen cemeteries, sometimes using fires to soften the ground before digging. Today you try exactly that. Etienne builds a small fire directly over the newest burial site while Thomas hacks frozen layers loose around the edges. Smoke curls low across the cemetery beneath pale grey skies. The smell of burning wood mixes strangely with frost and disturbed earth. It works! Barely. The softened ground beneath the fire turns muddy while everything around it remains solid as castle walls. Digging becomes an awkward process of thawing, striking, scraping, and swearing quietly into scarves. Mostly the swearing helps emotionally. The cemetery looks different now too. Snow smooths older graves into gentle white shapes beneath the trees. Crosses lean from drifts like crooked black teeth. The chapel roof glitters with ice along every edge. Beautiful. Cold enough to kill a person in their sleep. Certainly, but undeniably beautiful. At midday, the burial cart arrives late because one wheel froze solid overnight. The horse pulling it snorts clouds into the freezing air while Thomas and two labourers unload bodies wrapped tightly against the weather. Frost gathers across the linen almost immediately. One woman buried today wears tiny blue flowers woven into her hair beneath the cloth. Summer flowers, preserved somehow. The sight startles you more than death itself. A few details survive the centuries strangely clearly in plague accounts. Tiny personal touches, a ribbon, a prayer book, a child's toy buried beside a parent, even during overwhelming catastrophe. Families continued trying to preserve individuality against the sheer scale of loss. You help lower the woman carefully into the half-frozen grave while snowflakes drift silently through the air. Father Luke's prayers emerge in visible clouds now. His cough sounds worse. Everyone notices. Nobody mentions it. By afternoon, the temperature drops further. Ice forms along the edges of water buckets inside the tool shed. Lantern oil thickens sluggishly. Your gloves freeze stiff whenever snow melts into the fabric. Even carrying bodies becomes harder because frozen cloth loses flexibility. The whole world feels rigid. Near the outer wall, you encounter two workers from another village burial ground. They arrived searching for spare tools after several handles snapped in the cold. One tells a story about gravediggers north of here storing heated stones inside boots before work each morning. The other claims villagers poured hot ale over frozen earth to soften it faster. Etienne becomes extremely interested in this method. You suspect not all the ale reached the ground. As evening approaches, townspeople begin spreading ashes along icy streets to prevent carts from sliding. Smoke rises from every chimney while church bells ring softly through the frozen dusk. The plague continues, but winter changes its rhythm somehow. Fewer people gather outdoors, funerals shorten, markets shrink. The whole town seems to fold inward around fires and candlelight. Inside the chapel, children sleep packed closely beneath blankets near the hearth, while the old nun stirs thick cabbage stew over low flames. Steam fogs the windows faintly. Peter looks up as you enter. "Your beard has ice in it," he says. You wipe your face immediately. The children laugh for the first time in days. A rare sound. During supper, Thomas explains that frozen ground once forced his grandfather's village to keep bodies temporarily inside a stone storehouse until spring thaw returned. The children stare at him wide-eyed. Etienne nods solemnly. "My uncle slept beside one all winter by mistake." The children gasp. "Was he frightened?" one asks. Etienne tears bread thoughtfully. "No, mostly confused." You're increasingly certain Etienne invents half these stories solely to entertain exhausted children beside plague fires. Still, nobody complains. Night falls early. Outside the chapel, stars glitter fiercely above the cemetery while frost spreads across every surface beneath the moonlight. The cold feels sharper than knives now. Your lungs ache with every breath while carrying lanterns toward the northern graves. Another burial waits. The ground there froze harder than expected. You spend nearly an hour striking the earth with iron tools while sparks flash occasionally from buried stone. The sound echoes across the silent cemetery again and again. Metal, ice, breath. A brutal rhythm. At one point Thomas pauses to flex numb fingers beside the lantern. "Never thought I'd miss mud," he mutters. You understand completely. Near midnight, wind begins moving through the trees beyond the walls. Snow lifts from the ground in thin, ghostly streams drifting across the graves. The orchard outside town disappears beneath pale, blowing frost. Father Luke finishes the final prayers slowly tonight. He looks exhausted enough to collapse beside the trench, yet still he stays until the grave closes fully. That stubbornness exists everywhere now. In the bakers rising before dawn, in the women hauling water through snow, in the children still laughing at foolish stories, and here in the cemetery too, where frozen earth fights every burial while exhausted workers continue digging anyway beneath the winter stars. By the time you return to the tool shed, your boots are coated white with frost and your shoulders feel splintered from labour. The fire inside burns low but steady. You sit beside it, listening to distant bells drifting softly through the frozen dark. Outside, the cemetery sleeps beneath snow and moonlight, and beneath that frozen ground, the town waits silently for spring. At first, the silence feels wrong. You wake before dawn expecting bells, expecting wheels grinding through frozen streets, expecting the low murmur of priests outside the chapel, expecting another knock at the cemetery gate. Instead, there is only wind. You lie still beneath rough blankets inside the tool shed, listening carefully to the quiet. Snow taps softly against the wooden walls. Somebody nearby snores gently. The fire has nearly died to glowing coals. No bells. That unsettles you more than noise ever did. For months, death has shaped the rhythm of every day so completely that the sudden absence of constant funerals feels unnatural, almost suspicious. You sit up slowly and stare toward the dark ceiling beams while cold air bites your face. Beside you, Tomas opens one eye. "You hear anything, you ask?" He listens, then shakes his head. Neither of you looks relieved. Outside, dawn arrives pale and brittle across the cemetery. Snow still covers most of the graves, though patches of dark earth now show through where sunlight touched longest yesterday. The sky appears clear for once, soft blue spreading slowly above the church tower. The churchyard looks enormous without crowds. That is the first thing you notice after stepping outside. For weeks every path overflowed with mourners. Carts, labourers, priests, children seeking shelter, smoke drifting from cleansing fires. Now only a few figures move quietly between the graves. The emptiness feels louder somehow. Records from several plague-struck towns suggest mortality sometimes eased unevenly, arriving in brutal waves followed by eerie lulls. Survivors often struggled emotionally during quieter periods because constant fear had reshaped their sense of normal life. You understand that immediately. The silence presses strangely against your thoughts all morning. You spend hours repairing damaged grave markers near the northern wall, while weak sunlight glitters across melting frost. Ravens hop lazily between stones searching for scraps. Somewhere in town, a blacksmith finally resumes hammering metal after weeks of near silence. The sound carries clearly through the cold air, life returning cautiously. Etienne joined you carrying replacement boards for broken crosses. Only 2 burials yesterday, he says. You nod. Feels strange. He pauses beside a leaning grave marker. I almost missed the noise. The moment those words leave his mouth, both of you stare at each other in a mild horror. Then Etienne laughs tiredly. Not the deaths, he clarifies quickly. Just knowing what comes next. That makes uncomfortable sense. Human beings adapt alarmingly fast to terrible routines. By midday, sunlight softens the snow enough that water drips steadily from chapel roofs. The cemetery paths grow muddy again beneath your boots. A faint smell of thawing earth rises through the air. You had forgotten spring eventually returns near the market square. Several shops reopen shutters fully for the first time in months. A cobbler hangs repaired boots outside his doorway. A woman sells onions and dried fish beside the fountain while 2 children chase one another through puddles nearby. The children's laughter echoes strangely through the square. Too bright almost. A baker tells Thomas that travellers have begun returning cautiously along the southern road. Another claims nearby villages report fewer deaths now as well. Nobody trusts the news completely. Fear lingers longer than plague. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere changes too. Fewer blankets line the walls because several orphaned children recently moved into surviving relatives' homes. Peter still remains, helping the old nun carry water and stack firewood with exaggerated seriousness. He salutes you proudly using a wooden spoon. You salute back. The nun rolls her eyes. One medieval writer described plague survivors wandering through half-empty streets afterward, feeling as though entire portions of the world had vanished overnight. That sensation hangs over the town now. Buildings remain standing. Wells still function. Fires still burn. Yet something invisible feels missing everywhere. People, voices once familiar, neighbours who never return. That afternoon, you accompany Father Luke through quieter streets than you have seen in many months. Smoke rises gently from chimneys while pale sunlight glows against wet cobblestones. Several abandoned houses remain shuttered tight, but others show signs of life returning. Laundry hanging outside, a door repaired, fresh bread cooling on windowsills. Ordinary things. The ordinary things almost break your heart. Luke notices you staring at a family gathered outside a reopened tavern. 2 parents share soup while their daughter feeds crumbs to birds beside the doorway. Feels strange seeing people sit together again. You admit. Luke nods slowly. People always return to each other eventually. His voice sounds weaker lately. The cough remains. Still, he walks beside you through every lane. Near the western gate, you pass the abandoned goldsmith's house from weeks earlier. Snow has melted from the steps now. One upstairs shutter hangs partly open, creaking softly in the breeze. No one returned. Etienne claims ghosts prefer wealthy homes because they contain softer furniture. You suspect Etienne would joke during the apocalypse itself, though perhaps that explains survival too. As evening approaches, only 1 burial arrives at the cemetery. 1? The number feels impossible. The funeral passes quietly beneath fading gold sunlight, while birds circle overhead through clear skies. The mourners linger longer than people have in months. They speak softly beside the grave after the prayers finish, instead of rushing away immediately. Nobody hurries them. There is finally time again. Afterward, Thomas stands beside the tool shed, staring across the cemetery. Look at this place, he murmurs. The graves stretch everywhere beneath thinning snow. New markers. Fresh earth. Rows upon rows shaped by winter. Plague, fear, and endless labour. You help dig so many of them, yet tonight the cemetery rests almost peacefully beneath the sunset. No waiting carts, no lines of mourners, no frantic calls for priests echoing through dark streets. Just wind moving gently through bare trees. A strange rumour begins spreading by nightfall that the plague vanished because the winter cold finally trapped evil spirits beneath the frozen ground. Another man insists certain stars shifted position last week and restored balance to the heavens. Mostly, people simply want explanations ending in hope for once. After dark, you sit outside the chapel beside Thomas and Etienne while a small fire crackles between you. The air smells of smoke, damp earth, and melting snow. Somewhere beyond the walls, an owl calls softly through the twilight. Nobody mentions ghosts tonight. The town itself feels tired beyond fear now. Exhausted, scarred, quiet. But alive. You lean back against the cold stone wall and listen carefully to the night. No bells, no screams. Only distant conversation drifting faintly from reopened taverns and homes, where survivors gather once more around soup pots, candles, and each other, and after so many months surrounded by death. That ordinary human noise sounds almost miraculous. The market smells alive again. That is the first thing you notice one cold morning while walking downhill from the cemetery carrying a sack of cracked lantern glass for repairs. For months the town smelled mostly of smoke, wet wool, grave soil, vinegar, and fear. Now another scent drifts through the streets. Fresh bread. Not much, just enough to surprise you. The bakery near the square reopened fully 3 days ago, and people keep slowing outside the doorway almost unconsciously, breathing in the warm smell as though reminding themselves life still exists beyond plague carts and chapel bells. You cannot blame them. Even the pigeons look more optimistic. Thin spring sunlight spreads across rooftops while snow melts steadily along the gutters. Water trickles through narrow channels beside the road carrying straw, ash, and bits of winter grime downhill toward the river. Above you, laundry flaps gently between buildings for the first time in months, colour returning and blue cloth, red stockings, white linen catching the breeze. The town still bears scars everywhere. Boarded houses remain abandoned. Entire workshops stand silent behind locked doors. Yet movement slowly returns to the streets. A cooper hammers barrel hoops outside his shop. A butcher sharpens knives beneath the awning. 2 women argue loudly about fish prices with enough enthusiasm to qualify as a public celebration. You pause near the fountain, listening to the sound. Ordinary complaints, wonderful things. Several communities across Europe experience strange economic shifts after severe plague outbreaks because so many workers had died or vanished. Surviving labourers suddenly became more valuable in certain trades. Wages rose in some towns, empty homes changed hands, apprentices inherited workshops unexpectedly. You begin noticing these changes quietly unfolding here too. Etienne arrives late to the cemetery one morning grinning like a criminal. "Baker offered me double pay to haul flour," he announces proudly. Thomas raises an eyebrow. "You taking it?" "Maybe." You stare at him. "You know how to bake?" "No," Etienne admits, "but apparently half the bakers are dead." A grim truth delivered with unfortunate confidence. Still, people need workers everywhere now. Carpenters, blacksmiths, teamsters, farmhands. Even gravediggers receive better meals occasionally because nobody wants the burial crews quitting halfway through recovery. The cemetery itself changes slowly as spring deepens. Grass begins pushing through disturbed earth between the graves. Snow retreats into shrinking grey patches beneath the walls. Birds return to the trees overhead, chirping loudly each morning as though entirely unaware they are perched above several months of collective trauma. Nature can be breathtakingly inconsiderate. One afternoon you help repair a collapsed fence near the northern edge while children from the chapel chase each other nearby. Peter now carries firewood without being asked, and acts deeply offended whenever anyone mentions he's still small enough to lose arguments against geese. The old nun laughs more often too. Even Father Luke manages occasional smiles between coughing fits. Though the cough worries you still, in town, taverns reopen cautiously after sunset, not crowded like before, but alive enough that music sometimes drifts through these streets at night again. Fiddles, singing, bad singing mostly, but sincere. Tomas drags you to one of the taverns after work despite your objections. Inside, the warmth nearly knocks you unconscious after months beside frozen graves. Smoke curls through the crowded room while stew simmers somewhere near the hearth. Men and women sit shoulder to shoulder drinking ale and speaking louder than necessary. As though trying to prove silence no longer controls the town, a musician plays near the fire. Terribly, yet nobody seems to care. A merchant at the next table explains excitedly that abandoned farmland outside town now sits available for almost nothing. Another man boasts he can demand higher wages repairing roofs because too few craftsmen remain. Not everyone celebrates these changes, of course. Many families mourn deeply. Others struggle with lost relatives, ruined businesses, or empty homes. Recovery arrives unevenly. Still, something beneath the surface has shifted. People who once accepted every lord's demand quietly begin questioning things now. You hear it in tavern conversations, in market arguments, in muttered complaints beside church steps. A mason tells Thomas he refused extra work last week until receiving better payment. Refused. The word hangs in the air almost scandalously. For generations, most labourers possessed very little power to bargain. Now shortages change the balance slightly in ways nobody fully understands yet. Outside the tavern later that night, warm rain falls gently across the streets instead of snow. You stand beneath the awning breathing damp spring air while distant bells echo from the church tower. Not funeral bells tonight, just evening prayer. The difference matters. As weeks pass, more market stalls reopen. Travellers return cautiously from nearby villages carrying wool, grain, and gossip. One peddler claims entire districts in larger cities still stand nearly empty. Another swears some nobles now compete fiercely for surviving workers to repair estates abandoned during the plague. Etienne listens carefully to every rumour involving increased wages. A practical man? At the cemetery, burial numbers continue shrinking, not ending entirely. The plague still lingers unpredictably, a sudden fever here. Another funeral there, enough to keep everyone cautious, but no longer endless. You finally have time for repairs again. Broken grave markers get straightened, pathways cleared, burial records reorganized inside the chapel. Thomas even begins planting herbs near the wall because, according to him, a graveyard should at least smell decent. Lavender, rosemary, sage. The cemetery slowly transforms from emergency ground back into sacred space. One evening near sunset, you walk through town carrying fresh candles from the market. The streets glow warmly beneath spring rain. Shop windows flicker with firelight while people move between doorways laughing softly beneath cloaks. A woman hangs flower garlands beside her bakery. Children splash barefoot through puddles. Someone somewhere cooks onions in butter, and the smell nearly makes you emotional. After so much death, survival itself feels almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Warm bread, rain on rooftops, music through open windows. You stop near the fountain where months earlier frightened crowds whispered plague rumours beside smoking fires. Now 2 apprentices argue over dice while an old man feeds crumbs to birds. The town breathes again. Not healed exactly. Perhaps never fully healed, but alive. When you finally return uphill toward the cemetery, twilight settles gently across the graves beneath pale blue skies. Birds rustle in the trees overhead, while soft rain darkens the earth between the markers. For the first time in many months, you realize something strange. The future has returned. The arguments begin quietly at first. Not shouting in the streets or furious sermons echoing from cathedral steps. Just little conversations spreading through taverns, workshops, kitchens, and market stalls now that people finally have enough breath left for questions again. Why did the plague come? Why did some survive while others vanished within days? And perhaps most dangerously of all, why did prayers save certain families but not others? You hear these discussions everywhere now. This evening, rain taps gently against the tavern roof while warm firelight flickers across crowded tables. The room smells of ale, damp cloaks, onions frying in fat, and wood smoke trapped beneath the beams overhead. You sit beside Thomas near the hearth nursing weak beer after a long day repairing grave markers in the cemetery. Nearby, merchants and labourers speak over one another while a musician quietly abuses a lute in the corner. At the next table, a butcher insists the plague arrived as punishment for greed and sinful living. A cooper immediately disagrees. If that were true, he mutters, half the nobility would be dead twice. Several people laugh into their cups. The butcher crosses himself. You stare carefully at your drink and decide not to participate. During and after the Black Death, explanations for the disaster varied wildly across medieval Europe. Some believed divine punishment caused the suffering. Others blamed poisoned air, unlucky weather, astrology, trade routes, outsiders, or combinations of all five delivered with complete confidence. Human beings truly hate unanswered questions. Thomas leans closer. You know what my uncle believed? You already regret asking. He said earthquakes beneath the sea poisoned the clouds. Was there an earthquake? No. Then why believe it? Thomas shrugs. It sounded impressive. Fair enough. Outside the tavern, twilight settles across wet streets while church bells ring softly through the rain. The town no longer feels trapped beneath immediate panic, but uncertainty lingers like smoke after a fire. People survived. Now they want meaning. The next morning, Father Luke delivers a sermon inside the chapel before a smaller congregation than existed before the plague. Candles flicker gently across stone walls, while rainwater slides down stained glass windows behind the altar. Luke speaks quietly about suffering, compassion, patience, about helping neighbours rather than fearing them. Several people listen with tearful eyes. Others look exhausted. A few stare at the floor. The old certainty many once carried toward religion feels different now. Not necessarily weaker, just more complicated. You notice it especially afterward while standing near the chapel doors. One woman kisses the wooden cross hanging around her neck before stepping carefully into the rain. Another mutters angrily that no amount of prayer saved her husband. Both reactions exist side by side now. One surviving chronicler wrote bitterly that some people grew more devout during the plague while others abandoned faith entirely after watching so many die, despite endless prayers and processions. The emotional landscape of survival proved uneven and deeply personal. Later that afternoon, you help Thomas clear weeds from the cemetery wall while clouds drift low overhead. Spring rain has turned everything green astonishingly fast. Grass pushes between graves. Small flowers bloom near older stones untouched for years. The cemetery looks softer now, less like a battlefield. Etienne arrives carrying fresh bread and gossip. Equally important resources, in his opinion. Traveller from the south says scholars in distant cities blame the planets. He announces. Thomas sighs immediately. Still the planets! Etienne tears bread thoughtfully. They say Mars and Saturn aligned badly. You glance upward toward the cloudy sky. Convenient to the planets to arrange themselves so suspiciously. Yet medieval astronomy and medicine often overlapped in fascinating ways. Learned physicians sometimes consulted star charts alongside herbal remedies, believing celestial movements influenced health, weather, and temperament. When knowledge remains limited, patterns become irresistible. Near sunset, a heated argument breaks out beside the market fountain between two merchants discussing whether plague victims should receive different burial prayers than ordinary dead. A priest eventually intervenes before the debate becomes physical. The tension surprises you. Then again, perhaps it should not. Communities reshaped by catastrophe rarely return unchanged. Even the children at the chapel ask strange questions now. Peter corners you while helping clean lanterns. Do you think the plague was a monster? He asks seriously. You pause. What kind of monster? One underground. You consider several possible answers. Finally you say, "If it was underground, I would have found it by now." Peter nods thoughtfully, as though this settles the matter completely. Children often absorb adult fears and transform them into simpler shapes. Monsters, curses, angry stars. Easier perhaps than imagining invisible sickness drifting silently through ordinary life. That evening, rain clears briefly and the sky glows pale gold above the town roofs. You walk alone through the burial ground carrying fresh flowers left by a widow earlier in the day. The graves stretch quietly beneath soft evening light. So many, yet birds sing in the trees overhead anyway. You stop near the newer trench burials outside the northern wall. Grass already grows there too now, thin and bright green against dark earth. The speed of nature's recovery feels almost rude. A pair of travelling scholars passed through town recently, according to Luke. One believed plague spread through contaminated air trapped in crowded streets. Another blamed invisible corruption carried between bodies and cloth. Listening to their theories apparently produced several hours of intense argument and absolutely no practical solutions. Still, you sense something changing slowly in the wider world beyond this town. Questions multiplying, people observing more carefully, doubting old assumptions. Not everyone welcomes that feeling. At the tavern later, an elderly man insists too much questioning itself invites disaster. The world works because God wills it, he declares loudly. Across the room, a younger mason mutters, "Then why build hospitals?" The silence afterwards stretches awkwardly long. Thomas kicks your boot beneath the table before you accidentally involve yourself. Wise decision. As night deepens, lanterns glow warmly along the streets while distant music drifts from reopened inns. Rainwater reflects candlelight across the cobblestones. The town feels alive again, but changed somehow beneath the surface. Less certain, perhaps more honest. Back at the cemetery, you pause beside the chapel steps before sleep. Cool spring air carries scents of wet grass, smoke and blooming herbs planted beside the walls. Somewhere in the darkness beyond town, travellers still carry stories about punishment, stars, poisoned air, angry saints, and wandering spirits. Maybe none fully explain what happened here. Maybe no explanation ever will. Yet tomorrow morning the sun will rise above the graves again. Bakers will knead dough, bells will ring, children will run through muddy streets. And life, stubborn and ordinary, will continue asking questions long after the plague itself grows quiet. The graves begin changing before the people fully notice. At first it is only small details. Fresh flowers appear more often beside burial stones. Families return carrying carved markers instead of rough boards hastily pushed into frozen earth. Paths through the cemetery grow straighter as workers clear weeds and repair damage left by the long winter. The panic burials fade slowly into memory, and in their place, new customs begin quietly taking root. You notice this one warm afternoon while helping Thomas replace broken crosses near the chapel wall. Spring sunlight filters through fresh, green leaves overhead, while bees drift lazily among the herbs planted beside the stones. The cemetery no longer smells of wet clay and smoke alone. Now there is rosemary, lavender, grass warmed by sunlight. A woman kneels nearby arranging white flowers carefully across a grave mound. Not rushed, not fearful, simply present. That alone feels new. During the worst plague months, funerals often became brief necessities. Quick prayers, frozen ground, mud, exhausted workers carrying too many dead. But now people linger again. They speak softly beside graves. They bring candles at dusk. Some even clean older family plots neglected during the chaos. Memory returns once survival loosens its grip. Peter follows you through the cemetery carrying tools twice his size and approximately 1/3 of the necessary coordination. "You missed a weed," he announces proudly beside a grave marker. You stare at the single tiny plant. "Excellent work," you tell him. He beams as though personally saving civilization. Near the northern wall, Thomas points toward several newly painted grave markers standing beside older weathered stones. "Families starting to write names again," he says quietly. "Indeed they are. Names, dates, little prayers carved into wood. Beloved wife, faithful son, gone to God." Simple words, yet somehow heavier after months when many burials happened without any markers at all. Some surviving cemeteries from plague periods reveal signs that memorial practices shifted afterward. Communities expanded burial grounds, altered spacing, improved record keeping, or developed new rituals emphasizing remembrance and family identity. Disaster changes how people think about death itself. At midday, Father Luke asks for help reorganizing burial records inside the chapel. Dust floats through warm sunlight while stacks of parchment cover nearly every table. The sheer number unsettles you. Names upon names written in fading ink. Luke rubs tired eyes while sorting pages. "We lost track during winter," he admits softly. No blame in his voice. Just fact. You spend hours helping rebuild the lists where possible. Bakers, tailors, mothers, apprentices. Some entries include ages, others only street names or occupations. A few contain tiny notes added later by surviving relatives. Loved music, always kind, buried beside father. You stop reading those eventually, they hurt too much. Outside, church bells ring gently through bright spring air. Open windows let in sounds of the recovering town below. Cartwheels, market voices, a dog barking furiously at something probably undeserving, life continuing loudly around rooms full of the dead. That evening, a small funeral procession enters the cemetery unlike any you have seen for months. No rushing, no fear. The family walks slowly carrying candles and woven flower garlands despite daylight still lingering. A musician follows quietly with a small harp. Children scatter herbs along the path ahead of the coffin. The entire ceremony feels careful, intentional. You stand beside Thomas watching while warm wind stirs the trees overhead. People trying to remember how funerals used to feel, he murmurs. He is right. For so long burial became labour, urgent, mechanical, necessary. Now grief begins reclaiming ceremony again. One curious practice spreading through nearby villages involves planting herbs directly atop plague graves. Some believe sweet scents honour the dead properly. Others claim rosemary and lavender purify lingering sickness from the soil itself. Thomas mostly likes that the cemetery finally smells less terrible. A practical philosopher, at sunset, several women arrive carrying baskets filled with candles in coloured glass holders. They place them carefully among the graves as twilight settles across the churchyard. Soon tiny lights flicker everywhere. Amber, red, gold. The cemetery glows softly beneath the evening sky. Peter stares in amazement. "It looks beautiful," he whispers. It does. Painfully so. For one suspended moment, the burial ground resembles not a place of horror but remembrance. Quiet voices drift through the warm air while candles tremble gently beside the stones. You realise people are reclaiming the space from fear, not forgetting what happened, never that, but reshaping memory into something survivable. Later near the tool shed, Etienne tells you about a village south of here where families now leave bread beside graves during spring festivals so the dead will not feel lonely. "Do the spirits eat it?" Peter asks immediately. Etienne considers carefully. "The dogs certainly do." That answer satisfies nobody except perhaps the dogs. As darkness deepens, townspeople continue arriving quietly with flowers, ribbons, carved crosses, and tiny offerings. One old man leaves a wooden flute beside a grave before walking away without speaking. A young mother presses her hand against a stone marker while humming softly to herself. Elsewhere, children chase fireflies between the paths until scolded by relatives. The cemetery no longer belongs entirely to grief now. It belongs to memory too. Inside the chapel, Luke finishes evening prayers beneath open windows carrying scents of fresh rain and blooming herbs. His voice remains weak, but steadier somehow. You sit afterward near the doorway watching candlelight flicker across the graves outside. Months ago the burial ground overflowed with panic. Mud, smoke, and endless labour. Lanterns swung through snowstorms while workers dug frozen trenches beneath black skies. Now flowers bloom there instead. Small changes, perhaps, yet meaningful. Human beings always rebuild rituals after catastrophe. New prayers, new anniversaries, new habits around loss. The shape of mourning changes because the survivors themselves have changed. You feel that truth deeply now. When the bells ring before midnight, the sound drifts gently over the candlelit graves and warm spring grass. Not alarming anymore, not urgent, just part of the night. You lean against the chapel doorway listening while fireflies drift slowly above the newer burial mounds beyond the wall. And for the first time since arriving in this town, the cemetery feels less like an ending and more like a place where memory quietly learns how to live beside the living again. Spring arrives so quietly that at first you almost miss it. One morning you step from the chapel carrying water buckets and realize the air no longer bites your lungs. The cold has loosened its grip sometime during the night. Not vanished completely, but softened. Birdsong drifts through the cemetery trees. Actual birdsong. For several stunned seconds you simply stand there listening, while pale gold sunlight spills slowly across the graves. Dew glitters atop fresh grass growing between the burial mounds. Tiny white flowers have appeared near the northern wall, where frozen trenches once waited beneath snow. The cemetery smells alive. Wet earth, herbs, rain warmed by sunlight. You close your eyes briefly and breathe it in. Around you, the town changes too. Windows stay open longer now. Market awnings flap brightly in the breeze. People linger outdoors after sunset instead of hurrying fearfully from place to place. Even clothing looks lighter somehow. Less wool, more colour. After months buried beneath smoke and winter mud, the return of green things feels almost shocking. Peter races through the cemetery carrying an armful of herbs nearly larger than himself. Look, he shouts proudly. Half the herbs spill immediately into the mud. You help him gather them while he talks breathlessly about frogs returning to the riverbank. Apparently this is important news. Honestly, after a plague winter, frogs sound miraculous. The old nun now keeps chapel windows open during daylight hours. Warm air moves softly through the stone rooms, carrying sounds from the recovering town below. Children laugh outside. A blacksmith hammers iron in steady rhythm. Somewhere nearby, someone practices flute badly but enthusiastically. The world sounds human again. You spend much of the day repairing older graves damaged during winter storms. The work feels different now. Slower, less desperate. You straighten leaning crosses while bees drift lazily among the lavender planted beside the walls. Thomas hums quietly while working nearby. You have never heard him hum before. It feels unsettling somehow, like discovering wolves enjoy embroidery. As the season changes, more travellers begin appearing along the roads outside town. Merchants return with wagons carrying cloth, wine, tools, and rumours from distant places. Some stories sound hopeful, others less so. One traveller claims certain cities still suffer fresh outbreaks. Another swears entire monasteries now stand empty. The plague may be fading here, but the wider world remains uncertain. Still, spring continues arriving anyway. You walk beyond the walls one afternoon toward the orchard burial ground used during the darkest winter weeks. Grass now covers most of the trench edges. Wildflowers push stubbornly through disturbed soil. Ravens still perch among the branches overhead, though even they seem less ominous in daylight. The orchard itself blooms. White blossoms drift softly through warm air while bees move lazily from tree to tree. Standing there now, it becomes difficult to reconcile this peaceful place with the frozen nights of lanterns, trenches, and exhausted prayers. Memory changes landscapes, or perhaps landscapes change memory. You kneel beside one of the trench markers adjusting a weathered wooden cross. Nearby, someone recently left fresh bread wrapped in cloth along with tiny spring flowers tied by ribbon. Not everyone stopped visiting. In many communities touched by plague, Survivors developed annual rituals of remembrance tied to seasons, feast days, or cemetery visits. Grief settled gradually into calendars and habits, rather than disappearing entirely. You understand how that happens now? Back inside town, gardens bloom behind houses once shuttered with fear. Women plant onions and herbs beside narrow lanes. Children chase chickens through muddy streets, while adults shout half-hearted warnings no one fully intends enforcing. Life grows noisy again. The taverns too. One evening you sit outside an inn beside Thomas and Etienne while warm rain taps gently across the rooftops. Lanterns glow amber above the street while musicians inside massacre another cheerful tune. Etienne tears bread dramatically. You know what I miss? You hesitate. Not digging frozen graves. No, the free soup from the monastery. A deeply spiritual reflection. Thomas laughs hard enough to cough into his ale. Nearby, merchants argue over grain prices while two apprentices flirt terribly beside the stable wall. The entire town seems awkwardly relearning ordinary social behaviour after months of fear and isolation. You realise something strange while watching them. People survived, but not unchanged. The baker smiles less than before. Luke moves slower now. Certain houses remain permanently dark, and you yourself no longer pass graveyards casually. Spring softens the world, but it does not erase it. Later that night, you walk alone through the cemetery beneath clear skies streaked pale silver with moonlight. Crickets sing softly in the grass. The chapel herbs release sweet scent into the cool air. So much life now surrounds the graves. Flowers climb old stones. Moss spreads across markers. Birds nest in the cemetery trees overhead. Nature wastes no time reclaiming sorrow. Near the chapel steps, you find Peter asleep against a wall clutching a half-carved wooden bird. The knife still rests loosely in his hand. You gently take it away before he accidentally removes several fingers during his dreams. The bird itself looks terrible. You decide not to mention that. Inside the chapel, Father Luke finishes evening prayers beneath candlelight glowing warm against old stone. His cough remains, though softer lately. He looks thinner than before the plague, older somehow around the eyes, yet peaceful too. Beautiful night, he says quietly as you enter. You nod. Outside, warm wind moves through the graveyard grass, while distant laughter drifts upward from taverns and open windows below. Somewhere in town, a mother sings softly to a child preparing for sleep. Months ago, the same streets echoed with bells and burial carts. Now they carry music. You step back outside before sleep and gaze across the cemetery one final time beneath the spring stars. The graves remain, the losses remain. But around them, life has already begun growing again with astonishing stubbornness. Tiny flowers through disturbed earth, children laughing beside chapel walls, rain falling warm instead of frozen, and somewhere beyond the rooftops, beyond the roads, beyond the memory of plague winters, another spring waits quietly for the living. You realize you're leaving on an ordinary morning, not during a storm. Not after some dramatic final burial beneath thunder and bells and tragic speeches delivered against the wind. History rarely arranges endings so neatly. Instead, dawn arrives soft and pale across the cemetery while birds chatter loudly in the trees overhead. Warm sunlight slips between the grave markers. Dew shines across the grass where frost once hardened the ground like iron. And you understand quietly while carrying water toward the chapel that your time here is ending. The feeling surprises you. For months the cemetery became the entire shape of your world. Lanterns swinging through snowstorms, wet earth beneath your boots, bells before dawn, smoke drifting across graves beneath grey skies. Now the town breathes differently. The burial carts come rarely. Children play outside the chapel without fear. Market stalls overflow with vegetables and cloth and shouting once more. Life has returned enough that gravediggers are no longer the busiest men in town. Frankly, that feels like excellent news for everyone involved. You sit beside the northern wall while morning light warms the stones. Nearby, Thomas repairs a fence post with unnecessary aggression, while Etienne attempts teaching Peter how to sharpen tools responsibly. This proves deeply optimistic. Peter nearly launches a whetstone into the herb garden within minutes. The cemetery smells of rosemary and damp grass, now instead of mud and smoke. Bees drift lazily through the lavender beside the chapel path. Somewhere beyond the walls, a woman sings while hanging laundry in the morning sun. The world sounds alive. Thomas notices your expression eventually. You thinking about leaving? You nod once. He hammers the fence another moment before answering. About time. No sadness in his voice. Just understanding. The plague changed everyone here. But it also trapped people together in strange suspended routines. Now roads reopen. Trade resumes. Opportunities appear elsewhere. Survivors begin moving forward whether ready or not. Even grief eventually learns to walk beside ordinary life. Throughout the spring, more townsfolk return to the cemetery not only to mourn but to speak with the workers who remained through the worst months. Bakers bring fresh loaves sometimes. Children deliver flowers. Families quietly thank the men who dug graves during winter storms when almost nobody else would step forward. You never know how to answer those thanks properly. Most days you simply nod awkwardly and look at your boots. The truth feels difficult to explain. You stayed because somebody had to. That is all. Near midday, Father Luke joins you beneath the shade of the chapel wall carrying 2 cups of watered wine. His cough still lingers faintly, though strength has returned slowly to his face over recent weeks. You survived, he says quietly. The word settles strangely in your chest. Survived. You think of frozen trenches outside the walls, lanterns and drifting snow, endless bells, empty streets, children sleeping beside chapel fires, graves collapsing in rainwater beneath black skies. Yes, somehow you survived. Luke hands you the wine. So did the town, he adds. That part feels more miraculous. The afternoon passes slowly and warmly beneath bright spring clouds. You help repair several older grave markers, while townspeople drift peacefully through the cemetery paths carrying flowers and prayer candles. One elderly woman pauses beside you. My husband rests here, she says softly, near one of the winter graves. You nod respectfully. He would have liked the flowers. You look down. Wildflowers bloom thickly around the marker now, yellow and white spreading through the grass where frozen mud once swallowed boots whole. The woman smiles faintly before walking away. You realize then that the cemetery no longer belongs entirely to death. It belongs to memory, to survival, to the stubborn insistence that names deserve remembering even after terrible winters pass. Toward evening, you walk alone beyond the town walls one final time toward the orchard burial ground. Warm wind moves through blossoming branches overhead, while insects hum lazily among the flowers. The trenches remain visible beneath the grass if you know where to look. You do. A few fresh ribbons flutter from wooden crosses planted there during spring. Someone recently left bread again beside one of the markers. Birds peck cheerfully at the crumbs. You sit beneath one of the orchard trees listening to leaves rustle softly above you. No bells, no cries for priests, only wind and distant birdsong. The silence feels different now than it did months earlier. Back then, silence meant fear, abandonment, streets emptied by plague. Now silence simply means peace. You close your eyes briefly. The memory of winter still lingers sharp inside you. Frozen lantern light, smoke, mud, the endless rhythm of shovels striking earth. Yet those memories already feel farther away somehow beneath the warmth of spring air. As sunset approaches, you return slowly toward town along the road beside green fields. Farmers work again beyond the hills. Sheep graze lazily beside stone fences. Travellers pass carrying trade goods and gossip from distant places recovering in their own uneven ways. The world moves forward. At the cemetery gate, Peter waits, holding something behind his back suspiciously. "You're leaving," he says accusingly. Eventually, he hands you the object awkwardly. The wooden bird, the terrible one, though now he has carved the wings properly at least. For luck, he mutters. You turn it over carefully in your hands. The carving remains uneven and splintered and deeply confusing anatomically. Yet somehow it feels more valuable than silver. Thank you say quietly. Peter shrugs hard enough to nearly dislocate himself emotionally. That night the town glows softly beneath warm spring darkness. Lanterns flicker in tavern windows. Music drifts faintly through open doors. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs loudly enough to startle pigeons from the rooftops. You stand one last time inside the cemetery beneath the stars. The graves stretch peacefully beneath moonlight and fresh grass. Herbs release gentle fragrance into the cool air. Fireflies drift slowly near the northern wall, where winter trenches once waited beneath snow. Months ago, this place felt like the end of the world. Now it simply feels quiet. You touch the little wooden bird inside your pocket while warm wind moves through the trees overhead. Then slowly, gently, you turn away from the graves and begin walking downhill toward the living town beyond the chapel bells and spring rain and lantern light. And behind you, beneath the peaceful grass of the old cemetery, the dead rest quietly at last. Sweet dreams,